in connection with the crime, the purpose of which was to poison the royal family. The family of the Marquis Lores was sentenced to death. Everyone present at the execution whispered that the Marquis's family had bribed the cook and mixed poison into the food. The young lady froze in shock as she saw her parents beheaded. She knew they wouldn't dare do something like that. The Crown Prince told Liam Laureate that the only thing you should hold a grudge against is your own powerlessness. Crown Prince Dylan von Vasilios looked at them with a smirk and disdain. The prince looked at Liam and told the guards to take him away. The young lady screamed she could not allow her brother to die. Liam, her timid and kind twin brother Liam, in turn looked at his sister with tears in his eyes and called out to her. The young lady was furious. She wanted it to stop and stop the execution. She knew that her brother did nothing. She knew that he was not capable of hurting a fly. She screamed with rage and called her brother. She screamed because she wanted it to stop. But a moment later, she saw her brother's severed head. She sank to the ground in despair. Lanoli could not believe everything that was happening. The prince looked at her with an arrogant grin and said that only she remained the daughter of the Marquise Lenali Lors. Lanoli looked at him with fury. She hated the prince. She knew that he had no forgiveness. But still she did not understand how he dared to deal so cruelly with her family. Lanoli glared at him as she knew she would never forgive him for this. A moment later, she was led to the chopping block. She realized that she had not done her role as a sister well enough. Her brother was constantly being bullied, and unfortunately, she didn't know about it. Now she realized that she should not have sent him to the academy with her parents. If only she knew about this, Tons would not allow the cruel prince to get his way. The prince looked with a grin and told them to kill her. I prayed to God, because I wanted to go back. The young lady finally looked at the prince with fury and wanted to go back to take revenge on him. She woke up screaming, and with tears in her eyes, Lanoli gasping for air. The young lady reached for her throat as she did not understand what was happening. A moment later, her brother rushed to her. He hugged her tightly as he was glad to see her. The young lady was frozen in confusion. She did not understand what was happening. Liam looked at her with tears in his eyes and said that it was very good that she woke up. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to see her brother. She asked in surprise if he was really alive, since she saw that his head was in place. The young man looked at his sister in surprise. Lanoli was at a loss. She didn't understand what it all meant. She knew they had to die. But the very minute she saw her living brother next to her, she was shocked. She looked at him with a smile and said that this was very good. He said that there was nothing good in this, since she had been lying around with fever all night, and he was worried as much as he thought that he would be left without his beloved sister. He said that during training she lost her balance and fell, and very badly. He said that their parents could not find a place for themselves. Liam was very worried about his sister's health. The young lady looked at him and asked for forgiveness. She said that next time she would be more careful. He said that if she hadn't woken up, she would have missed the initiation ceremony since it was the day after tomorrow. He said that, to be honest, he doesn't really want to go there. Lanali said that this couldn't be done, and that you should definitely attend the ceremony. She looked at him and asked where he wanted to go. The young man looked at her in surprise and puzzlement. Looking at her, he asked if she had memory lapses. He said that he was going to enter Fortis Academy. He said that this was a consequence of the blow, and he needed to call a doctor immediately. She told him to wait a little and calm down. She said, puzzled, that she just had a nightmare and was a little confused. That's all. She was surprised, didn't understand what was going on. He looked at her and asked if everything was fine with her. She looked at her brother in surprise and saw that he looked much younger. She thought that they must be 16 years old now. Now she realized that she had gone back 3 years before entering. Her kind and smart younger brother. Her pride. He wielded magic better than the ball. However, in their pedigree, from generation to generation, men became knights. At the academy, he enrolled in the knightly faculty. But there, he did not show good abilities, so he was ridiculed by those around him. And in the end, the crown prince set his eyes on him. She was angry because she remembered that the crown prince took away their happy life. Lanoli understood that if her brother entered the academy again, the tragedy would repeat itself with her family. She was in shock and didn't know what to do now. The brother looked at his sister with sadness. He did not understand why she behaved this way. He was sad because he couldn't fully use his sword like sister. He looked at her and asked, even though they were twins, Why were there so many differences between them? The young lady looked at her brother intently. She did not know what to answer. He looked at her and said that if she had been born a boy, then everything would have been different. The young lady was taken aback by his words. Lina Lee did not think that he would ever say such a thing. A moment later, she looked at him as he gave her a good idea. Lina Lee said it was a good idea. She pulled his ear because she wanted to tell him something. The young man was taken aback and said that it hurt him. She pulled herself closer to him and started talking about her plan. Her brother was shocked by his sister's plans. A moment later, he said that this was a very risky plan. He was worried that they might be discovered. She looked at him with a smile and told him not to worry so much as no one would know about anything. Some time later, they entered their father's room, Lenily opening the doors in a hurry. The man looked at his children in surprise. He was in shock. The young lady called her father. She wanted to talk to him and tell him about her plan. He jumped out of his chair and ran to his daughter with the speed of lightning. The young lady looked at him, and she said in all seriousness that she had a conversation with him. The father rushed to his daughter in joy, as he was very worried about her. She was in shock, as it seemed to her that she was having déjà vu again. Her father was happy to ask if she was okay. Since she had just woken up, Lena Lee wanted him to let her go, as she was having trouble breathing. She looked at him and said that everything was fine now, so he shouldn't worry about her. He said with a smile that this was very good. The man was glad that his daughter was on the mend. The young lady looked closely at her father and said that they needed to talk. He looked at his daughter in surprise and asked what she wanted to talk about. Lena Lee thought about it for a long time and came to the conclusion that she should go to the academy of her brother's place. Lena Lee wanted to protect her family, and she had no choice. Her father and brother were shocked. They did not expect her to do this. They shouted at her to stop. The young lady looked at her father and said that she would go to the academy instead of her brother. She looked at them and said that this was not discussed. The young lady looked in surprise at the beautiful academy, which beckoned with its beauty. The country's main training center for knights and magicians. There are only 50 places for boys in the Faculty of Chivalry. The Faculty of Magic has 50 places for both boys and girls. The threshold for the academic year is high. Only 150 people pass it. The young lady remembered the prince and wondered what would happen if she failed the selection. She understood that she had to do everything possible and be sure to protect a happy family. She looked at her family and said that she had something to tell them. She cut off her hair and angrily said that she would go to the academy instead of her brother. The father and brother were shocked by such a statement from the young lady. They did not expect this. Her father looked at her and asked in a trembling voice in rage if she was really going to take her brother's place at the academy. He shouted that this was completely absurd. He said that next year she was planning a wedding with the Duke. He was shocked because despite this, she dared to cut off her precious hair. The father said with tears in his eyes that her hair was so beautiful. He wondered why she did that. She understood that everyone was worried about her, but still she said that knighthood was not for her brother. She said that he had a talent for magic, and his father should have paid attention to this as well. The father was shocked, since in their family tree, all the men were knights. He asked her who, if not her brother, would become the head of the family. The young lady stated that she would like to become the heir of the family. She said that she would dress up in a man's suit and become Liam and gain the necessary knowledge and skills at the knightly faculty. She said that's why she cut off her hair. The man was furious. He asked what she was even saying. He said that as a girl, she wouldn't be allowed anywhere near such a place. She said that she would be careful and not be discovered. He kept shouting with rage that it was useless and she needed to learn how to manage a household. The young lady looked sideways at her brother and said that he could do this. Liam was shocked by his sister's statement. The brothers and sister discussed this topic for some time. The father listened to them and choked with anger. He shouted angrily that he would never let her do this. The father shouted that she could be discovered, and then their family would end, and he could not allow this. He said that she is a girl, and there is no need for her to hold a sword in her hands, since her happiness lies in marriage. She looked at him and said that a woman's happiness is not limited to getting married. Her father was frozen in misunderstanding. He was shocked by his daughter's words. The young lady said with a smile that she didn't think the Duke would accept her with such short hair. He said he still couldn't let her do that. She asked him and said that she would definitely take care to glorify their mouth. She understood that she could not allow the tragedy to happen again. The man looked closely at his daughter, but did not answer. He sighed heavily and agreed with her scam. He saw that she could not be convinced. The young lady was very happy, but her brother was scared since this idea was dubious. Her father angrily said that she only had 1 year, and if she could not prove that she was suitable for the role of heiress, then she will be immediately returned home and married. He looked at his daughter and asked if everything was clear to her. The young lady said with a smile that she understood everything and would do everything. She was very happy since she managed to achieve her goal. The young lady mocked her brother as her clothes fit him perfectly, and it looked funny. She, passing by the students, remembered her brother and laughed. A moment later, she heard people talking about her behind her back. She was surprised. The young lady looked closely at the other girls and sighed heavily as she realized that they were not scientists who had no idea, and that was good. She understood that she still couldn't stand out. She remembered about just life, and that her brother told her then that he ran into the crown prince at the ceremony. She understood that she should be careful and not get involved in a conflict with the prince. In order to avoid her death in the future, she heard some noise from afar. A moment later, all the ladies looked with a smile at the carriage from which the young, beautiful knights were getting out. Mr. Arnold always shines brighter than the sun and was admired by everyone. Everyone wanted to catch Eldrick's cold gaze. He was a mystery to young ladies. Everyone said that Mr. Kyle was in a depressed mood, but he was still beautiful. And Crown Prince Dylan has always had a noble appearance. The young lady glared at the Crown Prince. She stared at them while everyone admired them. Phaeacius was the name given to the rulers of the academy, those who supported their country. Duke Krish's lineage of great magicians was ahead of everyone else. Pedigree of the powerful knights of Duke Houseman. Responsible for governing the country is the Duke Bahart bloodline. These three families serve the emperor from generation to generation. They are the three main dukes who support this country in every possible way. The heirs of each family entered the academy last year, and the crown prince was also among them. Both students and teachers have no power over them. In fact, it is these four who control the academy, which is why they were called Phaeacius. The young ladies called out to the crown prince in embarrassment. Lena Lee, in turn, knew that it was the man everyone was talking about who had falsely accused and executed her family. She understood that she needed to avoid contact with him. The prince thought for a moment, since regarding the smaller cheers, he did not understand what was the matter. As they walked through the crowd, the crown prince heard someone admiring the handsome young man. The crown prince looked to the side angrily, as he did not know that there was a new guy. In the crowd, he saw a guy who stood with his back to him. The prince called the newcomer and asked if he was from the knightly faculty. Lenali froze in surprise. The prince said with contempt that he was very gentle and also asked the question whether in their time even such little ones had a chance of admission. The prince said that a woman's face is a bonus. The prince said that it seems that the faculty of chivalry does not value anything. Eldrick wanted to stop the prince. Arnold said with a smile that he would like to watch the show. The prince looked at the young man with contempt and asked how he was going to hold the sword with such thin hands. Lenali was in shock. She froze and could not utter a word. She didn't know what could be worse, since she always wanted to avoid meeting him. The root of all evil was the crown prince. Lenali looked at the crown prince angrily. She was furious. The prince, in turn, was taken aback and looked at the young man in surprise. A moment later, he said with a grin that he was very impudent and also told the young man to immediately tell him his name. Looking down, she said her name was Liam Loris. The prince said with a grin that they are famous for the fact that in their family there is an uneducated girl who has not yet been married. The young lady was shocked by such a statement. She did not understand why he was saying this. The prince said that she was just a beast-like girl who liked to swing a sword with men, and Wergman was going to be her groom. The prince said that this was a very bad choice. The young lady was very angry with the prince. She wanted to hit him, but she still understood that she needed to control her ardor. The prince looked at the young man and said that he did not like his look. The prince said with a grin that he was very funny, since no one had dared to behave like that in front of the prince before. A moment later, he raised his sword to her face. The young lady froze in disbelief. The prince said with a grin that he was challenging him to a duel. Lena Lee was in shock. She didn't understand what was happening. The prince said with a grin that after his victory, The young man would become his slave. She was in shock and did not understand what was happening and how it had come to this. She was furious because she saw that he was just a tyrant and not the crown prince. The prince asked with a grin if he was really scared. The prince said with a grin that it seems like such a weakling, as he will become the next head of the family. And if this happens, then his line will come to an end. She wondered if one of the most powerful clans would disappear from the face of the earth. She didn't care when they mocked her, but she couldn't allow her clan to be mocked. The young people froze in shock. She did not expect this. She brought the sword to the crown prince's throat. He froze in bewilderment. A moment later, she angrily said that she accepted his challenge. She said that after her victory, he would reconsider the words he had said earlier. The prince said with a grin that they had agreed he was shocked, since the young man behaved very arrogantly. A moment later, the young people fled, as they believed that it was better to stay away from the battle. The young lady and the prince fought a fierce battle. Arnold looked at the young man in surprise, and said that he was very good. The prince was shocked, because he understood that the young man fought very well. He noticed that the young man seemed to have a woman's face, but he had a lot of strength. He understood that he could not be allowed to defeat himself. They looked at each other with fury. No one wanted to give up. The young lady was furious. She knew she had to win. The young lady said with a smile that victory was hers. The knight was shocked since he had never lost to a girl before. His friend was surprised since she had defeated high-ranking knights. He said that she was an outstanding girl. Lena Lee was furious. She struck the prince blow after blow with the speed of lightning. The prince was shocked. He understood that he should have expected this from a member of such a famous family. But at the same time, the prince was very surprised that this guy remained out of the public eye. The young lady understood that she had to become stronger for the sake of her family. She knew she had to become stronger for her brother and protect him in every way possible. She told herself angrily that they would lose this fight. She dealt a strong blow, and the prince was shocked by this. Everyone looked at the fight in surprise. The spectators were in shock. They froze in bewilderment, as they did not expect such an ending. Lena Lee dealt the final blow, and the prince lost his sword. She was shocked because she realized that she had won. She was happy about it. The prince looked at her with anger and rage, and at the same time he swore. His friends were shocked, as they did not expect the young man to defeat the crown prince. The young ladies were shocked, as they also did not expect the new guy to defeat the crown prince. Kyle looked at the young man with a grin and interest, as Liam interested him. Lena Lee sighed heavily and enjoyed the moments of victory. The prince looked at the young man with anger. He was furious because he lost to the frail boy. She looked at the crown prince and said that victory was hers. Without raising his head, the prince said that he would keep his word. The prince came closer to the young man and said that he should not turn up his nose since he was lucky in only one fight. A moment later, he told his friends that it was time for them to leave. The young people left, and Lenali looked after them. She was glad that it was all over. She trembled and wondered if she was just lucky. She was furious, because she was not just lucky, but she was training for her life. The young lady was shocked, as her first day of school was already problematic. She didn't understand how it all came to a duel. She didn't know what to do now. The young lady was shocked, as the prince's attention was now completely focused on her. She knew it was entirely his fault, as he shouldn't have made fun of her family. A moment later, she entered the classroom and saw the oppressive atmosphere. Lena Lee looked at everyone in surprise because she did not expect that everything would be so serious. As she walked past the students, she could hear them whispering. They talked incessantly about Liam. She understood that the gossip did not take long to arrive. She, of course, assumed such an outcome, but not so quickly. She understood that no one would want to get themselves into trouble because of this. But Liam was also lonely. He could not make friends. But she knew that everything would be the other way around for her, and she would be able to overcome everything. She remembered her poor brother. She was glad that he stayed at home. The young lady knew that she would not give up because she had a goal. She wanted to make every effort and find at least one friend. A moment later, the young man approached hers. She looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not expect anyone to speak to her. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that he saw that duel. He said that he was amazed at how he dealt with the crown prince. Lena Lee froze in shock as she realized that she would be able to make a friend after everything. He looked at her and said with a smile that his name was Agni. Extending his hand, He said with a smile that he was very pleased to meet him. Lenali was shocked as she now had a new friend. She said her name was Liam, and she was also happy to meet her. Agni asked if she was really from a family of aristocrats, and he also asked for forgiveness for being disrespectful. She told him with a smile not to worry, as much as everyone was equal in class. He looked at Liam in surprise and asked if he really thought so. Agni said that people around were gossiping that it was better not to mess with Liam, but he still wanted to get to know each other. He said with a smile that Liam was a pretty good guy. She was surprised, looked at him and thanked him with a smile. She was in shock, did not understand what those around her were talking about behind her back. From that moment on, she and Agni often spent time together. Agni is a very friendly and optimistic guy. Lenali was glad to have his company. She thought that soon her brother would probably be delighted with such a wonderful friend. A few days after that exciting first day of school, something happened. Looking at her watch, she realized that she had spent longer in the library than she thought, because her friend must have been waiting for her very much. The young lady heard some strange noise. She decided to see what was happening. A moment later, she saw that there was a large crowd of people near the fountain. Also saw the crown prince, who was looking at her with a grin. Arnold sighed heavily and said that the crown prince had taken up his task again. Eldic, looking away, said that he hoped that the prince would soon get tired of this. She noticed that Kyle was also present. Lenali was not surprised since the whole company was assembled. Lenali was confused. She didn't understand what was happening. She came closer and saw the young man in the fountain. She was taken aback. A moment later, she clearly saw her friend's face. The young lady was shocked. She screamed his name. She couldn't believe that someone could do this to him. She ran closer to the fountain and angrily asked what was happening. A moment later, a sword appeared in front of her from somewhere. Lenali was taken aback. She looked up and saw the prince. The crown prince looked at her furiously. He was glad that Liam was here now. She looked at him angrily and asked what happened and why her friend was in such a state. The crown prince said it was because this guy ignored his orders and dared to associate with such trash as Liam. She was shocked as she remembered what her friend had said earlier. She glared at the crown prince and asked if it was only for this reason. The prince said that people who don't do what they're told should be punished, and this guy only got hurt because of Liam. A moment later, she heard her friend breathing heavily and coughing. She called out to him. A moment later, she came closer to him as she wanted to help him. She said that she would definitely take him to the infirmary. The prince looked at Liam and asked how dare he ignore him. The prince angrily said that it looked like Liam had become completely insolent. The prince shouted to his friends to start acting. The young lady looked sideways at the prince. She was angry with him and wanted to tear him apart. A moment later, she saw that she had been hanging on the balls for days. She understood that now they could kill her. But unexpectedly for her, a shield appeared above her, and the young people struck their swords against the shield. She was surprised and did not understand what was happening and where the magic circle came from. The crown prince walked up to his friend and shouted at him. Kyle looked at the prince and said that he had already gone too far. The young lady looked intently at her savior. She did not understand why he was doing this. The prince looked angrily at his friend and asked why he was doing this. The young man supported the magic circle, but did not answer the prince. A moment later, Kyle told the prince that he was going too far, and the young man could have died. The prince angrily told him not to stand in his way. The young lady looked at Kyle in surprise and did not understand why he saved her. Arnold ran up to them and with a smile told them to stop quarreling. Arnold looked at them and said that hoping Arisa wouldn't be a problem tomorrow. The princes looked at Liam with a grin, and he had new ideas on how to teach Liam a lesson. A moment later, the prince came closer to the young man. Lenali was in shock, as she did not know what to expect from the prince. He said with a grin that he really had done wrong, and also asked Liam if he would forgive him. The young lady was at a loss. She did not understand why the prince changed his mood so quickly. The prince said that, as an apology, he would like to invite him to Arasi. Dylan looked at the young man with a grin, as he understood that he would not refuse the tea party. Everyone present was shocked by such a statement. They never expected the prince to make such a statement. The young lady was at a loss. She did not understand what the prince wanted from her. Everyone whispered in surprise and wondered if this new guy would go to the tea party. Lenali looked at the prince in surprise, as she wondered why she had to go to the tea party. The prince said that today he really crossed the line, and was very sorry about it. She was shocked and did not understand why he changed his attitude so abruptly. She understood that this was very strange, and he was planning something. The prince said that if the young man agreed to join the tea drinking, he would be guaranteed a bright future, and the marquise would be delighted. The prince asked if he was really going to refuse such a tempting offer. She understood that she had no right to refuse because of her status, but she wondered what he was planning. She said that she would gladly accept his invitation. The prince looked at her with a grin and said that this was very good. As he left, he said that the tea party starts tomorrow at 16 o'clock pavilion in the Eastern Garden. The prince said with a grin that he would look forward to his arrival. Kyle looked closely at the young man's feet, but did not answer. A moment later, they were all leaving behind the prince. The young lady stared after them. She sighed heavily, as she was glad that they had left. Aris comes from the word aristocracy. This is the central body of the academy. Its members are elected. Participants are considered the faces of the academy, and it was an important event for the students. It is composed of students from noble families, 4 of whom are members of Phaseos. This reception takes place regularly. All the aristocrats on the network want to attend it at least once. The girl's popularity will increase significantly. Her advantage will be recognized by the ladies around her, and we will become the center of attention in society. The man is guaranteed a carefree future, and after graduating from the academy, he has every chance to take the elite path of bureaucracy or knighthood. The young lady showered in her thoughts. Lena hoped her friend was okay as she took him to the infirmary. But after that, the teacher told me to go and change my wet clothes and clean myself up. You could say she was simply kicked out of the infirmary. She hoped that she was safe now, since the shower was in a separate building, and she had locked the door. Lena was shocked as her friend got hurt a lot because of her. She understood that a little more, and he would have died. Lena knew that the prince could do anything to her friend. She didn't know if her friend would want to communicate with her again when he came to his senses. She remembered the crown prince and wondered what he was really up to. She had a very bad feeling and didn't want to go to the tea party. Gathering her thoughts, she decided to leave the shower as she had many unresolved questions. But unexpectedly for her, she met a young man. She was shocked as it was. Kyle Lena froze as she realized that she was finished. He looked at her in surprise. Kyle did not expect this. He froze in place in surprise. The young lady was shocked as she realized that it was the prince's friend standing in front of her. She wondered how this happened if she had locked the door. He looked at her and said with a grin that it looked like she really was a girl. She was shocked as she followed all the precautions, but still she was discovered, and also a friend of the prince. A few minutes later, she was kneeling next to Kyle. He thought about it and said that it turns out that instead of her brother, who never learned to wield a sword, she attends the academy. He looked at her and said that she acted bravely. The young lady asked him not to tell anyone about this. She begged him on her knees. He looked at her with a surprised look and asked what the one whose place she had taken was doing. She looked at him timidly because she didn't know what to say or where to start. A moment later, she said that he was learning housekeeping instead. Kyle laughed and said that this was something new. He did not expect to hear something like that. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand his reaction. She looked at him closely and realized that he was somehow strange. He smiled and said that she was strange and crazy. He said that few would be able to lift a sword against the crown prince, and this stupid but still funny. She wondered if it was a compliment. Kyle thought for a moment and realized why the prince was so obsessed. She looked at him and timidly asked if he could keep her secret. She understood that if the truth was revealed, her family would end. She could not allow this to happen. She looked at him and said that she was begging him and would do anything. He looked at her in surprise, but later still agreed. The young lady was surprised because it was too simple. Kyle looked at her and said with a smile that he would keep her secret. The young lady thanked him with a smile. He said, looking at her, that on one condition he would keep her secret. Kyle said he would share this information with everyone if he ever got bored. The young lady was frozen in misunderstanding. She did not understand what she needed to do in order for him to keep her secret. He said with a smile that she would have to entertain him. Lena was puzzled. She was shocked because she realized that he was just a terrible person who decided to take advantage of her weakness. She was in shock and very depressed as everything was going wrong. The young lady slowly entered the office. Lena Lee knew what awaited her in the classroom. Awestruck later, she heard someone calling her. Her classmates quickly ran up to her. They asked if Liam had received an invitation to tea. They wanted to know how this happened. The young lady was taken aback. She did not expect such a reaction. She noticed that everything had changed instantly. Although until that moment, everyone had completely ignored her existence. She understood that everything had changed because of the tea party. She was shocked because she did not think that it would affect her life so much. She looked at them and asked if Agni had come to study. Her classmates said that he had not come yet because she had severe injuries to him, and he should rest today. The young lady looked at them sadly. She was very worried about her friend and wanted him to get better soon. She felt very sad at heart as she understood that he had suffered because of her. She understood that if the man's drinking occurred without incident, she would visit him and apologize to him. The young lady was going to a tea party. She didn't want to go there, and she didn't feel at ease. The prince looked at the young man with a grin and said that, after all, he came and gave it to his wife, being frightened. Lenali looked at the prince and said that this was an invitation from His Majesty, and she could not refuse. Lena Lee looked at the crown prince and said that this was His Majesty's invitation, and she could not refuse. He looked at her and said with a grin that he gave Liam credit for his courage. She looked at him intently, without taking her eyes off, as she was very angry. A moment later, she glared at everyone gathered, as they were the current members of the Aris. Lena Lee knew that this was like being asked to cage with the lion. She thought that she needed to start preparing for the worst outcome of events. The prince looked at her with a grin and welcomed Aris to the tea party. The prince looked intently at the young man, and with a grin told everyone gathered to greet him with all their hearts. She looked at the prince in surprise, as she did not expect him to say something like that. The young lady slowly approached the table as she had dressed to sit down. The prince said that his place was not there. She looked at the prince in surprise. The prince pointed his hand to a place near the maid. Lena Lee was taken aback, as she did not understand what was happening. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. She asked if she hadn't been invited to the tea party. The prince looked at her with contempt and said that, of course, he was invited, but as a waiter. The young lady was taken aback because she did not understand whether this was true. Lena Lee was ready for anything but not for this. She noticed that everyone was making fun of her. She felt uneasy. Now she understood what he was really up to. He wanted everyone to see how the eldest son of the Mark would forget to serve. Lena Lee was shocked because she understood that he had called her here to make fun of her. But still she understood that she needed to control herself since no one would take her side here. She understood that there was no point in arguing with them since that was all they were waiting for. The prince asked if he really didn't want to be a waiter. He barely had time to cook when she said that she understood everything. The prince looked at Liam in surprise. He didn't expect him to agree so quickly. Lena Lee asked if she should just serve them. She said that she was ready to fulfill any order. The prince, in turn, was taken aback by such a statement, since he did not expect such a thing. Everyone was shocked and watched with bated breath what was happening. Kyle looked at the young lady with a smile, as he expected she was quite entertaining. The maid, in turn, trembled with fear, looking at the young man. In fact, service became the work of a maid. She was only trained in housekeeping, but this did not mean that she had no experience at all. She looked at the maid and asked what she should do. The maid was taken aback. She looked at the maid and with a smile told her not to worry, and to say whatever she wanted, since she would not reproach her. The maid was taken aback and looked at the young man in surprise. She did not know how to behave correctly in this situation. A moment later, she asked if he could serve the gentleman from Phaseus. The young lady looked at the maid and said with a smile that she understood everything and would do everything. Lena Lee looked at our service and noticed that one cup was different from all the others. Lena Lee looked at the cup in surprise and asked the maid. The maid said that it was Mr. Dillon's personal cup. The young lady was not even surprised by this fact. A moment later, she began to perform her duties. Everyone was surprised that he could actually cope with ridicule, and they said that he was still the son of a marquise. One lady looked at him with a grin and said that it was just a disgrace. Lena Lee noticed that she was being closely monitored and decided to show everything she was capable of. A moment later, everyone looked at the young man in surprise. She knew that no matter what anyone said, she was not only good at wielding a sword, but also in other areas as well. She loved drinking tea, and therefore knew all the intricacies of preparing the drink. The crown prince was shocked as he understood that the young man was still good at this. The young lady slowly approached the prince and brought him a cup of tea. Linley still looked intently at the cup of tea for last. She was surprised that he had a different cup and did not understand that he was putting himself above others just because he was the crown prince. A moment later, she remembered that her brother had once told her that in a past life, her brother was condemned. But Liam in turn shouted that he did not add any poison and poisoned the prince for a day. The young lady froze in place as she realized that this had happened in the past. She was shocked because she now realized that history could repeat itself. Because of this situation, her brother was expelled from the academy. She was shocked and wondered how she could forget such a thing. She knew this could probably happen again. The crown prince, with a smile, said that they could start drinking tea. She pushed the maid away and ran to the table. She wanted to stop Dylan from drinking tea. The young lady rushed to the prince as she wanted to stop him from drinking tea. She snatched the cup of tea from his hands, and the prince froze for a moment in bewilderment. He looked at her in surprise, and a moment later, in her lightning speed, she snatched the cup from him and drank the tea. A few minutes later, she coughed up blood. She was now convinced that there was poison in the cup. The crown prince froze in shock. He did not expect this. He rushed to the young man and caught him. The crown prince was shocked. He shouted to the young man to wake up. Everyone present was shocked. They did not expect anything like this at the tea party. The prince shouted and called him, but the young man did not answer. She looked at the prince in surprise, because she had previously thought that he was just a cold-blooded person, but now she saw that he was worried about someone. Arnold was shocked. He did not understand how this could happen. Eldick shouted to everyone to calm down. He was in shock as he noticed that it was poison. The prince looked at his friends in shock. He did not expect that someone could poison him. The little boy rushed to his mother, who was sitting on the floor. He cried and called her because he was very afraid and worried. She was sitting on the floor covered in blood. The prince looked dumbfounded at his friend, who was also covered in blood in his arms. A moment later, Kyle came closer to them and began to heal Liam. The young people were surprised and did not understand what Kyle was doing. Kyle looked sideways at them and told them to be quiet. Eldick looked at Kyle in surprise because he didn't know that he could heal. The prince looked at them and asked what kind of lucky turn of fate they were. Kyle said he didn't do anything special. Raising the young man, he said that he simply provided first aid and nothing more. Kyle looked at the prince and said he would take Liam to the infirmary. The prince looked at his friend, dumbfounded, and with a trembling voice agreed with him. A moment later, everyone watched as Kyle carried Liam in his arms. They were in shock and could not come to their senses. Arnold, looking after them, said that this guy saved someone, and apparently it will rain tomorrow. Eldick came closer to the prince and asked if everything was okay with him. The prince said that he was fine. Eldick angrily shouted for everyone to remain in their places, as they would check everyone who could have put poison in the tea. Eldick told Arnold to call the guards. He understood everything and went to carry out orders. The prince in turn trembled with fear. Kyle looked at the young lady and said that if he hadn't been there, she might have died, and revealed that she was actually a girl and not a guy. Looking at her, he said that apparently she realized that the tea was poisoned and decided to drink it. He was a little surprised because she was really reckless. Kyle thought for a moment because he realized that she definitely didn't add poison. He understood that she was almost set up. He understood that the target of the criminal was the crown prince himself. Kyle stared at the young lady who was lying unconscious. He was furious that someone had their eye on his favorite. He said angrily that he would make this man regret his actions until his death. The young lady woke up and was confused. She did not understand where she was. A moment later, she heard someone's voice. She was surprised to see the crown prince next to her. She was in shock, did not understand why he was next to her. The prince looked at the young man and said that there was no need for standard phrases, since he wanted to hear an explanation of what really happened. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. She did not understand what he wanted to hear from her. A moment later, she remembered that you had poisoned the tea that was intended for the prince, and he must have suspected her. She understood that she could be executed after her actions, but she did not want this at all. She was shocked and didn't know how best to act in this situation. The prince looked at her and asked if it was he who poured poison into his cup. The young lady shouted that it was not she who did this. She understood that she needed to deny any of his accusations against hers. Dylan asked how he then realized that the tea was poisoned, since the prince was sure that the young man drank it for this reason. She was shocked because she knew that she couldn't say that she had heard that the tea was poisoned from her brother in a past life. A moment later, she screamed from her heart that it was just her intuition. The prince looked at her dumbfounded, as he did not expect to hear something like that. When the prince said that his mug was different from all the others, and she had some kind of feeling or just a bad feeling, but still at that moment she wondered who had poured poison into the crown prince. She understood that no one would admit to such an offense. At that moment, she could not think of anything better than just drinking the poison herself. The prince asked if this was the only reason he drank tea. The prince was furious. Looking at the young man, he told him not to joke, so the young lady looked at the prince in surprise as he was very angry. The prince angrily asked if this was the only reason why he had done such a stupid thing. He shouted that just a little more, and he would have been gone. The prince said that the young man must have held a grudge against him, but still he did not understand why the young man decided to drink the poison instead of him. Lenali looked at the prince, as she did not expect such a strong reaction from him. The poor prince remembered his mother. He shouted when he was little that he did not want her to die from poison again. His memories stirred up, and he felt very sad and hurt. The young lady looked closely at the prince, but did not understand why he had such a suffering face. She watched him closely, but all she saw was only sadness and regret on his face. She looked at him and said that it was all because she was a knight. He looked at her in surprise, because he did not expect her to say something like that. She said that even if His Highness hates her, she is first and foremost a knighthood student. She knew that she entered the academy to protect her family, and even if they are in danger, she will still protect them in any way. She looked closely at the prince and said that in the future, as part of her duty, she would need to protect him. The young lady understood that in order to change the future, she should not hesitate now. She looked at him and said that for this reason, it was better to start doing it right now. The prince stood frozen in shock as he realized that despite all his terrible actions towards the young man, he had risked his own life to protect him. The young lady froze indignantly. She did not understand what would happen next. The prince looked at the young man and told him never to do that again. Lenali froze in surprise. The crown prince was furious. He shouted that he shouldn't take his life so lightly in his mind. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. She didn't expect such a reaction from him. He shouted angrily that if he saw him drinking poison in front of him again, he would finish him off before I had any effect. The young lady froze in bewilderment. She did not expect this. Looking at him, she dumbfoundedly agreed with him. She didn't understand what he meant and wondered if the future had changed, and she was still able to escape execution. Looking away, the prince said that, however, he could not help but thank him for saving him. Elena looked at him as he thanked her for saving her. Lenali was very surprised, as she did not expect the crown prince to do something like that. Dylan looked at the young man and said that, even if he thanked him, he didn't have to make such a face. She looked at him dumbfounded, as he looked away a little embarrassed. A moment later, she laughed. The prince looked at the young man in confusion and surprise. His reaction relieved all the tension that had been hanging between them and made her laugh. Dylan looked at the young man and asked what he was laughing at. The young lady asked him to forgive him for her laughter. The prince noticed that this guy was surprisingly cute when he smiled. The prince was surprised since he did not understand what was happening to him. He wondered if he really thought the guy was cute. And the young ladies admired Mr. Liam for saving His Highness the Prince. They discussed him and wondered if he was better after being poisoned. They thought he had very graceful features. The young lady was in shock. As she walked past all the young ladies, she wondered what was going on. Agni approached Liam and said with admiration that he was very cool and very popular. The young lady was surprised. She looked at her friend and asked what was going on. Agni said that after he fell ill due to the poison that His Highness's place drank, the entire academy spoke only of him as a hero who saved the life of the crown prince. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand when everything could change so much. She wanted to behave as quietly as possible so that the crown prince would not pay attention to her, but everything turned out completely the opposite. Agni said with a smile that this was just great news, since now the young man was recognized by the fascias. The young lady was surprised. She thought differently. Agni looked at him and asked if he didn't deserve this status. He said that when he was beaten, He thought that he would die like this, but his brave friend saved him. He later said that they were both chosen for the battle of swords and magic. Agni smiled and sincerely thanked Liam. The young lady was surprised, because despite the fact that he was in a serious condition because of her, they were still good friends. She was amazed and very happy about this fact. She walked closer to her friend, and with a smile said that she would like them both to win the battle of swords and magic. Agni with a smile said that he first needs to train hard. The young lady looked at him and said with a smile that this was true and they should work hard. A battle of swords and magic. Select members of 4 academies, including Fortis Academy, risk the pride and honor of their school in an annual meeting where participants compete in their strength and magic. It would not be an exaggeration to say that those who study in these academies are diligently improving themselves for the sake of this convention. And all because the winners get a place in the Imperial Guard. She understood that now that she had been selected, she needed to live up to the name of her family. She wanted to finally get her father to recognize her as his successor. The young people listened to the conversation between Liam and Agni. They were furious since Liam was very starstruck. They walked slowly and had a casual conversation, but later stopped because they noticed a group of young people. Eldic looked at Liam in surprise and called him. He looked at the young man and asked how he was feeling. Liam looked at them in surprise and said that everything was fine, and he apologized for the inconvenience. Eldic sighed heavily and said that the identity of the criminal who added the poison was currently being investigated, but they would definitely find out who did it. She looked at the young people in surprise and thanked them. She understood that the criminal who framed her brother was never found in her previous life. She was very puzzled by this fact and wondered who this person really was. Eldic said that the poison did not have time to kill him, and he was very glad that Kyle was able to provide first aid on time. The young lady looked at Kyle in surprise, as she did not expect to hear something like that. She looked at Kyle in surprise and asked if he had really given her the antidote. Kyle smiled and said that was true. She was very puzzled and asked for forgiveness, as she did not know how to thank him. He came closer to her and told her not to worry, as everything was fine. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise. He came closer to her and quietly said with a smile that now she would have to entertain him even longer. The young lady froze in place. Kyle smiled and said that they would see each other later at training for the elite. The young lady looked after them, puzzled. She wondered what Kyle was thinking about. She understood that he knew her identity, and she could not make a mistake in front of him. Agni looked at his friend and said about the task that he was really cool. He was shocked since Liam could communicate so naturally with Facius. The young man, looking sideways at the leaving young people, said that he was still afraid of them. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and said that she couldn't help herself, although to be honest, she didn't like everything herself, and she was still very nervous. Agni looked at him in surprise and said that it was not noticeable to him. The young lady looked at her friend and said that she had forgotten something. She said with a smile that she would come back and pick up one of her things, and also apologized that he would have to go without her. Agni looked after his friend and told him not to be late for the training of the chosen ones. The young lady smiled and ran in her direction. The young man watched Liam from around the corner. The young lady made her way from behind the bushes to the locker room. She understood that in theory, there should be no one in the locker room. She mentally apologized to her friend for lying about the forgotten item, but she simply couldn't change clothes with everyone. At such moments, she felt all the inconveniences of being disguised as a man. She wanted to quickly change clothes and catch up with her friend, but a moment later, someone grabbed her from behind. She was surprised and very scared because she did not understand whose hand grabbed her. She looked sideways at the man because she wanted to know who he was. The man looked at the young man with a grin and said that it turned out to be easier than he thought, and without any extra hassle. The young lady was very scared and excited. She did not understand what kind of people were standing next to her, since they did not look like academy students. The man looked at him with a grin and asked for forgiveness. He said that he had nothing against him. She was in shock, did not understand what was happening. The man said that this was just an order from the customer, and they would have to hurt him. A little, Linelli was shocked by such a statement. She mentally asked someone for help. The young people were walking around and getting ready for classes, as classes were about to start soon. The prince slowly examined everyone present. He was a little surprised and wondered why Liam hadn't come until now. The prince became a little angry with himself and realized that this did not concern him at all. Agni ran into the training ground and looked back. He was surprised that his friend was still not there. A moment later, he realized that his friend was not there either. He was very excited about this fact. Kyle looked at the young man in surprise and asked if he was really looking for Liam. Kyle was surprised since he was with Agni all the time. The young man was very frightened and worried that a representative of Phaesias had approached him, but he understood that despite his fear, he had to tell them. The young man shouted with rage that he could not find his friend anywhere. The prince and Kyle were excited. The prince looked at the young man and asked what he meant. The young man said that on the way here, his friend realized that he had forgotten something and returned. He waited for Liam in front of the training ground, but still he did not come, so he went in search of him. Agni said that not far from the locker room, he found only Liam's sword lying. The prince was surprised and puzzled, since he did not know a knighthood student who would take off his sword. Arnold looked at his friends and asked if they thought this was all strange. Eldic looked at the young man and asked if he had noticed anything suspicious in the area. Agni said that he only noticed a crowd of bustling students. Arnold, thoughtful, said that it seemed that the young man was called a hero. Kyle said that this could be a bad sign. Eldic said that in this case he dared to assume that some kind of misfortune had happened to the young man. The prince was shocked. He understood that even if this guy got into trouble, it had nothing to do with him. But still, he couldn't just leave it like that since he saved his life. The prince was furious that the young man could get into trouble. He understood that this had nothing to do with him, but he could not allow his life to be in danger. Arnold looked at the prince in surprise and asked where he ran. The young lady fell to the ground with a crash. The men pushed her, and she was in great pain. She was in shock and did not understand why these guys brought her to such a place. She did not understand for what purpose they were beating her. The man looked at the young man with a grin and said that he had such a face as if he did not understand what he was talking about. The man said with a grin that whoever assigned them this was not happy about the fact that he was elected to the convention. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand what kind of ridiculous hostility was. She wondered who it could be. The man said that for this reason they need to break at least one of his arms, while the other man looked at the young man with a grin and said that he had a pretty cute face. The man came closer to him and said with a grin that they were very sorry that he was a guy. The man was shocked as he noticed that the boy was very fragile. The man wondered how such a small boy could handle a sword like that. The men looked at the young man and said with a grin that it was time to have fun, and they needed to finish everything quickly. But the young lady in turn did not intend to give up just like that. She furiously pushed away the man who was walking towards her with a knife in his hand. The man shouted with rage for the young man to calm down. A moment later, the man hit her with the burden, and with a knife caught her cheek, thereby cutting the piece of fabric that covered her mouth. She screamed angrily and called for someone to help. The man furiously attacked the young man and shouted at him to shut his mouth. A moment later, he furiously pushed at the young man, and he fell to the floor with a crash. The man was very angry. He looked at the young man who was lying on the ground and said that he had more fortitude than he expected. The man looked at the young man and said with contempt that so that he would not try to run away, they would start from the feet. The young lady was taken aback. A moment later, she saw the prince who was calling her. She was very surprised because she did not expect to see him. The men were in shock because they did not expect anyone to break into their place. The prince saw that his friend's shirt was torn. He was furious and looked at the men with contempt and asked what they were going to do with him. The men were dumbfounded and stared at the crown prince. They were shocked because they realized that it was him, and they did not know what to do now. One of the men shouted that they needed to run, but the crown prince stood at the entrance and blocked the exit for them. The men rushed into battle and shouted for him to get out of the way, but the crown prince pulled out his sword and began to strike blow after blow. One man was thrown against the wall and fell to the ground with a crash. The crown prince hit the other with his fist and he screamed. The third rushed into battle with a knife in his hand. The man was furious since the crown prince scattered all his friends. The prince noticed that a man with a knife was coming at him and furiously fought off the attack with his sword. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand what the crown prince was doing here, and also did not understand why he came to save her. The crown prince looked sideways at the young man and asked how he was feeling. My lady looked at him in surprise. She froze and did not know what to answer. She wondered if he had come to her aid. But later, she looked at her jacket and noticed that it was torn. Lena didn't know what to do since she couldn't curl up in a ball, since he would still get closer and notice what she was hiding. She was shocked because she knew that the prince would immediately understand that she was a girl, and she needed to get up immediately. But she couldn't get up because her leg hurt so bad. The prince came closer to her and covered her with his cloak. She looked at him in surprise. He looked at the young man and said that he needed to put it on for now, and then he would return it. She looked at the prince in surprise and wondered if he really disgusted her. Looking at the prince, she wondered why he did this and why he behaved kindly towards hers. A moment later, Arnold ran into the building and asked what happened. The prince looked at Eldek and told him to call the guards. The young people froze in bewilderment. They did not understand what was happening. Eldek looked at them and said that he would immediately call the guards. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and asked how he knew that she was here. Kyle looked at her with a smile and said that these guys gave her a hint. He said with a smile that they should get to know each other like his friends. The young lady was surprised because they were wolves. She did not expect to see something like this. A moment later, the wolves wrapped their arms around Kyle's neck. Kyle, looking at them, smiled. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise and wondered if this scarf was really made from a wolf's fur coat. She was amazed at the sight and did not understand how this was possible. Kyle looked at the man and asked who the customer was. The man said that they could kill him, but he still wouldn't tell. Kyle looked at the man with a grin and asked if it was true. A moment later, Kyle set one of the wolves, and it growled. The man was very scared. Kyle asked the man with a grin if he really wanted to die. The prince looked at the young man and asked if his legs really hurt. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and said that it was so. The prince looked sideways at his friend and said that he would help him. Linali was shocked because she did not expect this from the prince. The prince looked at his comrade and said that he was quite light. Linali was in shock and did not know what to do since they were too close to each other. The prince looked at the young man and said that he should eat more while he grabbed him so that he touched his chest. The prince froze in misunderstanding. The young lady was in shock because she understood that this was very dangerous. She was shocked as he touched her breast. The young lady did not know what to do. The prince, in turn, looked at her dumbfounded. The young lady was in shock. She didn't know what to do now. An awkward atmosphere reigned between them. She wondered if he had already realized that she was a girl. The young lady trembled because she did not know what to answer. She muttered more than one thing to her. The prince looked sideways at her. Lenali was confused. She didn't know what she should say in this situation. Her head was buzzing and nothing came to mind. The crown prince angrily shouted to the young man that he had a bruise. The young lady froze in surprise, looking at the prince. For a moment, dead silence reigned. The prince looked at him and said that when he supported him, he accidentally touched his chest, and something swelled there. Kyle, standing to the side, could barely contain his laughter. The young lady was taken aback and looked at the prince in surprise. She was surprised, but at the same time very glad that the thought did not even occur to him that she could be a girl. She said that, in fact, she was kicked on the chest. The prince was furious. He looked at the young man and told him to quickly show it, as bones might be broken. The young lady was shocked because she understood that it was just a dead end. Kyle approached the prince and told him not to worry so much about how he would heal the young man. The young lady was shocked and at the same time glad, since her savior had come to her aid again. He saved her from the prince, and she thought that he was a really good man. Kyle got closer to the young lady and said that it was very good that the prince was a little distant. She looked at the young man in surprise and dumbfounded. Mentally, she took her words back as she realized that Kyle was simply amusing himself with this situation. A moment later, Kyle cast a healing spell. A few minutes later, a bright light illuminated the young lady. Kyle looked at her and said that he had done everything and there should be no more. He looked at her with a smile and said that there shouldn't be any noticeable wounds either. Kyle walked closer to her and touched her cheek where the wound was previously visible. The young lady looked at her leg in surprise and really didn't feel any pain. She was surprised since he saved her. For the second time, she thought that his healing magic was simply wonderful. The prince looked intently at the young people. He was confused. He admitted that he had been hit hard on the chest and had suffered a bruise there, but still the breasts were very soft like a girl's. Dylan was taken aback by his reasonings. For a moment, the prince was taken aback, as he did not know whether his thoughts were true or not. He was shocked and told himself to stop fantasizing about the injured man, as he realized that his friend was truly a guy. The young lady looked at Kyle and thanked him with a smile for healing her wounds. Kyle said with a smile that he didn't do anything special, and it didn't cost him much effort. The prince looked at them intently. He was a little angry, because despite the fact that he saved the young man, not a word of gratitude was said to him, and Liam smiled only at Kyle. The prince was shocked and wondered what kind of hazy feeling he was feeling right now. Immediately after this, the criminals who were captured were detained by Llanelli, including the main culprit, the son of Earl Dumbell. 3 more students were expelled, and the case was closed. And after a few days, the students trained hard. Llanelli and Agni trained hard and put up a tough fight. Agni fell to the ground, breathing heavily. He looked at his friend and said that he was still strong. The young lady looked at him and thanked him with a smile. She said that he was also not amiss. He looked at Liam with a smile and said that he couldn't lose anymore. The young lady looked closely at her friend and smiled. Kyle walked closer to them and told her Naledi that she was doing great as always. She was surprised that he approached them. She greeted Kyle in a hurry. At the same time, she addressed him in accordance with her status. Kyle smiled and said that she could just call him Kyle, and there was no need for honors. She looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true. The young lady was surprised and did not understand why he suddenly said that. Kyle brought the wolf carcass closer to her and told her with a smile that he thought these guys liked her too. The young lady was shocked as the wolf licked her cheek. She was in shock and still couldn't accept the fact that his scarf was made of a wolf. She looked at Kyle and asked if he really came here for more than just that. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really didn't want to call him by his name. He looked at her with a grin and said that apparently she would have to reveal the fact that she was a girl. The young lady was very angry with him and did not understand why he liked to tease her so much. She understood that being discovered would be much worse than calling the guy by name. The young lady looked at him embarrassedly and said that she understood everything while she called him by name. Kyle was very surprised at first, but then said with a grin that it sounded good. She looked at him in surprise. A moment later, she heard the prince calling her and was taken aback. Turning around, she saw the prince nearby. The wolf looked warily at the prince and bared his teeth. The prince looked at him and told him to fight him. Llanelli was shocked by such a statement. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She did not understand what he was talking about. Llanelli was in shock. She didn't understand why he chose her. She didn't want to put herself at risk anymore. She didn't understand why he showed increased attention to her. Arnold looked at them in surprise and intently. Arnold looked at his friend and asked why the prince was picking on Liam. Eldick, sighing heavily, said that this had nothing to do with him. Arnold looked at them and said that maybe it was because Liam had such a cute face. Eldick was shocked by such a statement. Arnold looked at his friend in surprise and asked what it was. Eldick looked at her friend dumbfounded and asked if he really liked guys. Arnold froze in place, not knowing what to answer, but a moment later, he shouted that it was not true. The young lady and the prince fought a fierce battle. No one wanted to give in or lose in sparring, and she was in shock, and she understood that the prince had become even stronger than he was before. She understood that he was also physically better than her. She wondered if this was the crown prince's true strength. While striking, she realized that she lacked power, and she could have taken it with speed, but she could not choose the right moment. She was shocked, because she understood that the prince was very strong. A moment later, the prince dealt a crushing blow, and the sword flew out of her hands. The young lady fell to the ground with a crash. She was in great pain from the blow. She sat on the ground and sighed heavily. She was in great pain. The prince looked at his opponent in surprise. Dylan was confused. The prince was shocked and could not understand why his opponent was so handsome. The prince was shocked. He looked at his friend in surprise and dumbfounded. The young lady looked at the prince closely and said with a smile that he was really strong. The prince froze in shock. The prince was shocked and could not understand how someone could be so sweet. The prince was puzzled. Looking at the young man, he ordered himself to calm down because he understood that he was a guy. A simple competition of strength would not compare to this. She knew that she had to become stronger. As she stood up, the young lady screamed in pain. When she fell, she hit herself hard. She was in shock because she realized that she had hit herself hard when she landed right on her ass. The prince looked at the young man in surprise and asked what was wrong with him. She was dumbfounded, looked at the prince and said that she was fine. The prince wondered if he had hurt himself. Looking at the young man, he asked again if he was okay, and also asked if he should give him a hand. A moment later, Kyle came closer to them and asked if Liam was okay, and gave him his hand. The prince looked at Kyle in surprise. Dylan looked at his friend in surprise, because he didn't understand why he cared so much about Liam. Kyle looked at the crown prince and said with a grin that it was unusual for the prince to act like that. The prince looked at his friend and said that the young man simply hurt himself during the battle with him, and naturally, he was responsible for it. Kyle looked at the prince with a grin and said that he could heal all the bruises. For a moment, an incomprehensible atmosphere reigned between them, and just a battle of glances. The prince looked at the young man with rage and shouted at him to get up, and also asked if it was not a great honor that he would give him his hand on purpose. Kyle told him, with a grin, that he could heal all his bruises. Lena Lee was confused. She didn't understand what was happening between them. The prince looked at the young man and asked if he would accept his helping hand. Kyle looked at him and said that he would accept his helping hand. The lady was simply in shock. She did not understand who she should choose. She wondered whether she could generally make the right choice in this situation. She angrily shouted that she would get up on her own without anyone's help. The prince turned away angrily and said that it didn't matter to him, and if he could stand up on his own, then there was no problem. Dylan looked sideways at his friend and said that it was time for them to go, since training time was over. Caillou looked at the young lady with a smile and waved his hand to her. He said that they would see each other later. The young lady sighed heavily as it was all over. She was shocked by the whole situation. Sometime later, she returned to the student dormitory of the night faculty of the academy. The lady sighed heavily as the school day was finally over. She was very tired and this fatigue was moral. But still, she wondered why the prince saved her. And later, he talked to her. The young lady was confused as to why he was showing attention to her today. She wondered if the poison incident was slowly changing the future. She was in shock because she understood that this was the same prince who ordered the execution of her entire family. She understood that she could not let her guard down. Looking at the table, Lenely saw the letter and was very surprised. She completely forgot that she had received the letter. The young lady nevertheless decided to see who the sender was. She noticed her true name on the envelope and realized that it was her brother who wrote it. She opened the letter with a smile because she wanted to know how her brother was doing. Her brother wrote about urgently returning home since the crown prince had personally sent them an invitation to the ball. The young lady was in shock. She didn't understand why the ball was happening at such a time. She wondered when was the last time you were at such a big and grandiose event. She was shocked because she understood that she had to go to the ball as a girl. She was confused and very excited because she understood that she could not come to the prince's ball. Lena Lee understood that the prince could guess that they had switched places. Lena Lee was in shock and did not understand what to do. Sometime later, the young lady returned to her native estate. She understood that this day had come. She thought many times about refusing the invitation, but still understood that the invitation was from the royal family and from the prince himself, so she understood that it could not be simply ignored without any reason. She didn't want that to be the point. She understood that be that, as it may, the fact of visiting was so important. She wondered if she could just come and chat for a while and leave. Upon entering the estate, she announced that she had already arrived. The maids bowed low and greeted their mistress with a smile. The young lady looked at the maids in surprise and said with a smile that she had not seen them for a long time. With the speed of lightning, the maids picked her up and said that they had little time, and the bath was already ready. They wanted to get to work quickly. The young lady was in shock. She shouted at them to wait since she had just returned, and she wanted to catch her breath a little. The maids angrily said that in this case she should have returned a few days earlier since the ball would take place that evening, and it was already close to noon. They said that they usually had time from early morning, so they could take their time. Yet the young lady did not argue and obeyed them. The maid looked at the lady and said that she was very sorry and could not come to her senses because he sees how her hair has become like her lady's. The young lady said that she still pretended to be her brother, to attend the academy, and even more so with such a length, it was more convenient for her. She said with a smile that she really missed someone washing her hair. Maya looked at the young lady and asked why she was so stubborn. She said that she liked her that way too. The young lady was shocked. She understood that she really couldn't go to the ball with such a hairstyle. She didn't know what to do in this case. After all the preparations were successfully completed, the young lady beamed. The maid smiled and said that she finally looked like herself, rather than saying that she was beautiful. She was happy about the transformation, but still felt uncomfortable. Because of her short hair, Lena Lee was worried whether she could go to the ball like this, since she could be recognized and declassified. Outside the door, her brother asked her if she had finished all the preparations, and if he could come in. She said with a smile that he could come in. She was glad that she would finally see her brother. Liam greeted his sister and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The young lady pounced on her brother and said with a smile that they really hadn't seen each other for a long time, and also asked if everything was fine with him. The young man looked at his sister in surprise and asked if she was really going to go to the ball with such a hairstyle. Lenely looked at him with a smile and asked if she couldn't walk like that. She looked at him and said that, unfortunately, due to her illness, she was not able to leave the mansion. He looked at his sister in surprise and asked what she was saying. Liam said that everything would be fine since he knew what to do. She looked at her brother in surprise. Lena Lee hoped that her hair would keep her at home. A moment later, the young man cast a spell. Lena Lee looked at her brother. She did not understand what was happening. A moment later, her hair was back as long as before, and she was very surprised. The young man smiled and said that now they were as before. He was glad that his sister had returned to her original appearance. The young lady was surprised. She did not expect such an effect. She said that it was simply amazing. She understood that it was still amazing, but now she definitely had to go to the ball. Liam extended his hand with a smile and said that he would accompany his sister. The young lady gazed at her smiling brother. He was beautiful. Lena Lee asked if he understood everything she said. Lena Lee said that under no circumstances should you deal with Phaeacius. He looked at her and said with a smile that he understood everything. She said that, moreover, you cannot act from afar from her. Lena Lee looked at him and asked if he understood. The young man said that he understood everything since she was telling him this for the second time. She understood that this was all true, but still she was very worried. She understood that if something wrong happened between her brother and the crown prince, everything could end in execution as it had before. A moment later, they were informed that they had already arrived. The young man, with a smile, told her to just keep her head up and everything would be fine. Liam asked if she understood his words. She looked at her brother puzzled, as she knew there was no point in worrying about everything. She understood that they had come very far, so they had to be prepared for anything. She understood that now they were just on the battlefield, and they had to do everything right. The young people slowly entered the hall. All those present looked at them intently, without looking away, since they were seen together for the first time at the ball. Everyone present was discussing her but her lady, as they had previously heard that she was very arrogant. The young boys couldn't believe it, because they saw that the young lady was very beautiful, but they also heard that she was very strong. The young lady looked intently at everyone present. It was her first time at the ball. It was her first time attending such an event, since she always thought that events in this garden were very boring. She noticed that everything at the ball was very elegant and truly matched the level of the royal family. One young man looked at his friend and said with a smile that he would try to talk to her. His friend sighed heavily and told him not to do this, since Bergman himself was her fiance. The young lady looked sideways at the young people as she felt their gaze on her. She looked at her brother and asked if she looked strange. The young man looked at his sister and said in surprise that she didn't look strange. He said with a smile that he thought today she was even more beautiful than usual. Lena Lee looked at her brother in surprise. A moment later, the young lady looking at her brother asked if it was true. She looked at the table with surprise and admiration and pushed her brother. She told him to look at the table as there were many different dishes there, and they all looked delicious. The young man looked at his sister with a smile and said that, even dressed up, she remains herself. She looked at her brother in surprise and embarrassed, said that she hoped it was a compliment. Liam smiled and said that of course it was a compliment, and he was very glad that she did not change. She noticed that in one corner there were very few people, and it was not conspicuous, and it was very calm there. She wanted to sneak away unnoticed, but still hoped that everything would be okay if she disappeared. Looking at her brother, she said that they could move away a little. But a moment later, a young lady approached them and introduced herself with a smile. Brother and sister looked at the young lady in surprise, as they did not know who she was. A moment later, a whole crowd of young ladies ran up to her brother. The young lady looked stunned with big eyes. But the entire crowd of women who surrounded her brother, Liam looked at all the young ladies in surprise, as he did not understand what was happening, but still Lena knew that his popularity had increased due to some circumstances at the academy. A moment later, she noticed that the young ladies had moved on to someone else. Not even a minute had passed before she noticed that facious representatives had entered the banquet hall. The young lady saw the crown prince, and behind him, his entire team. She was in shock because she understood that her affairs were bad, and she needed to quickly leave before anyone noticed her. She turned around in search of her brother because she wanted to quickly leave the banquet hall with him. But to her surprise, her brother disappeared somewhere. She looked around the whole hall, but still could not find her brother. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand what to do in this situation. She did not understand where her brother had gone, and for this reason, she was very worried. She was in shock because she still couldn't find him. Lena Lee thought that soon he was back in the hall. But still, she couldn't just go there because there were people there that she didn't want to see. A moment later, lost in her thoughts, she accidentally collided with Kyle. She looked at the young man in surprise and asked for forgiveness. Kyle looked at the young lady in surprise. Since he did not expect to see her, Lena Lee was in shock and did not understand that Kyle had forgotten in the corridor. She was in shock because she did not expect to meet him here. Looking at him with a stunned look, she asked for forgiveness for accidentally bumping into him. She was in shock, did not understand why she met him right now. And here Kyle looked at her with a smile and asked where her former cheerfulness had gone. He smiled and said that this was the first time he had seen her in this form. Kyle kissed her sweet hand tenderly. Lena Lee froze in surprise. The young lady was simply shocked by his action. She did not understand why he was acting so kindly to her. Kyle smiled and said she looked great in that dress. The young lady looked at Kyle with embarrassment and thanked him. She understood that he spoke well since he liked to watch her reaction. He looked at her and said that he didn't want anyone to see her in this guise except him. Even he wanted to lock up such beauty somewhere. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She did not expect him to say something like that. She trembled while looking at him as she understood that he wanted to lock her up. She was shocked, wondering if she really looked so strange that he wanted to lock her up somewhere. Kyle looked at her and asked what she was doing here. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she could not tell him the reasons. She understood that if she said that she was looking for her brother, he would laugh at her and follow her. She understood that it was better for her not to tell the real reason she looked away and said that it was not worth Mr. Kyle's attention. And besides, she was already returning to the banquet hall. The young man looked at the young lady with a smile on his face. He said that in that case he could accompany her. The young lady was very surprised when he extended his hand to her. She froze in surprise because she didn't know what to do. He said with a smile that he was going to do the same so they could go together. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She was very nervous and wondered why he felt it was so necessary to accompany her. He came closer to her and with a smile asked if he could take her hand. She understood that if they went together, she could meet the prince. He looked at her and said with a satisfied grin that he would reveal her secret to everyone. She was furious because she thought that he was a true devil. Kyle looked at her with a smile and asked what she would do. She was in shock. She understood that if they guessed everything, then she would be in trouble. A moment later, she said with a smile that she would gladly accept his offer. The young lady and her escort entered the hall. All the guests were surprised they discussed them. They said that, of course, their couple was sad, but still they looked very beautiful. They also discussed the engagement of the young lady to the son of the Marquis. The young lady was in shock. She felt all the eyes that were directed at her. As soon as she entered the hall, she immediately heard someone else's whisper. Kyle looked at her with a smile because he saw that she was thinking about something. He thought that she was still a very funny girl. Lenali, with the speed of lightning, let go of his hand and said that she had some urgent business, so she would have to leave him. She also thanked him for accompanying her. She understood that she needed to separate from him as quickly as possible until she met the prince. The young lady knew that she needed to find her brother quickly. But unexpectedly for her, Kyle grabbed her hand. She was surprised, turned around and looked at him. He asked with a smile, "How about one melody?" The young lady looked dumbfounded at her companion and asked if he knew the rules of the first dance. In their country, the rule of the first dance is that only the engaged or relatives can perform it. She wondered what would happen if she danced with Kyle, who was not her fiancé. She stared at him, and he looked at her with a smirk on his face. She understood that he understood and knew everything perfectly. She looked at him with a smile and asked if he was making fun of her again. She said that, however, he would not be able to deceive her anymore. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise. A moment later, he said with a smile that he was very sorry. The young lady was in shock as she still could not find her brother. She didn't understand where he could have gone. She wondered if he really left her and returned home. She was furious because she understood that this simply could not happen, and he would not do this to her. She was very tired, but suddenly someone called her. She turned around in surprise and saw a young man. She saw that a young man approached her and asked if she would mind dancing with him. She looked at him in surprise. A moment later, another young man came up to them and addressed her. The young man looked at her and said that it was better for her to choose him. The young lady was shocked. She did not expect this. For some time, they argued among themselves who would dance with the young, beautiful lady. She was in shock and could not understand why they suddenly started asking her to dance. She wondered if the fact that she was accompanied by Kyle had influenced this. More men joined them, and they argued for some time about who would dance with her. She glanced sideways into the distance and noticed that the balcony was very close. She looked at the young people and, asking for forgiveness, said that she had forgotten about one important matter, so she would go. The young people were shocked. The young lady realized that this was the only way to leave. Lenali jumped over the balcony railing. As she fell, she was surprised to notice the crown prince. The crown prince froze, and at this time, the young lady fell on him. He was in shock and could not do anything. The young lady looked at the stunned prince and realized that her second life ended at such a moment. The young lady fell right on top of the prince and was in great pain. She was in shock because she understood that this was a collapse. She wondered what the prince was doing on the street, since she was sure that he was in the hall. She didn't understand what she should do in such a situation. She was shocked because she understood that this time the reason for her execution would be falling on the prince. With a trembling voice, she asked for his forgiveness. He looked at her furiously and asked if she had the courage to sit on him. A moment later, he looked at her in surprise. He looked at her dumbfounded and asked if she was Liam Lors. The lady looked at the prince in shock. She realized that he had guessed everything. She was in shock and did not understand what to do and how he knew her. The crown prince looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why he was in this form. She understood that she needed to calm down now, since she was now a girl. She understood that he did not seem to understand anything and only confused her with her brother. She understood that she needed to quickly get out of this situation and said that he understood everything wrong and she was his sister. Dylan looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was talking about twins. A moment later, the young lady stood up and introduced herself. She said her name was Lenali Lores. She said that Liam was her younger twin brother. She hoped that the prince would understand her correctly and not figure out her secret. The prince was confused. He had the feeling that his friend had changed his clothes, since his face, voice, and energy were all like his friend's. The crown prince was a little dumbfounded and remembered his friend. It all seemed suspicious to him. At the same time, the crown prince said about some rumors. The young lady thought for a moment, as she did not understand what he wanted to say. A moment later, she remembered that the prince had said that her family was known for having an ill-mannered girl who did not marry. She looked at the prince with fury and asked if he really wanted to say that she was a stubborn girl who was disgracing her family. The young lady was frozen in shock, not knowing what she had done, and wondering how she dared say such a thing to the crown prince. The crown princes laughed. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She didn't understand why he was laughing. The crown prince glanced sideways at the young lady and said with a smile that it seemed like the rumors were true. He said that she jumped on him, and after all this, she also reproached him for this. The prince looked at the young lady and said that she was a careless girl. Lanoli was shocked because she saw that he was not angry with her. A moment later, she asked him to forgive her for her behavior. Lanoli saw that he had hurt his hand and rushed towards him, screaming. The crown prince was in shock. Dylan was taken aback by surprise. He said that there was nothing wrong with it, and he hurt himself. She looked at his hand and took out her handkerchief. She said that this, of course, cannot be called first aid, but still she wanted to help. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise. He did not understand why his heart was beating so quickly. He noticed that his face was also flushed. Dylan didn't understand why he felt so strange. She came closer to him and said with a smile that it was very good that she bandaged his hand, but still the wound should be treated later. The young lady was taken aback as she realized that she had touched him without permission. A moment later, with lightning speed, she asked for his forgiveness. The crown prince was shocked because while she was talking, he saw her as his friend. The crown prince was a little puzzled because he realized that she looked very much like his friend, but he still didn't understand why he immediately remembered him when looking at her. The young lady was trembling with fear. Lanoli understood that this was just horror, and she was finished. Not only did she jump on him, causing him to fall, but she also didn't cut him down, talk to him, and hurt him. She understood that if he decided to do it, she would be executed. She wanted to run away before he said so. She didn't know what to think of and say, but at that moment, her stomach began to growl. The young lady looked at the prince in embarrassment and puzzlement, and the prince in turn burst out laughing and turned away. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise. It was the first time he had met such an unpredictable girl. The young lady hesitated as she was very ashamed. The prince was surprised as the young lady first apologized with tears in her eyes, then suddenly fell into a rage and immediately worried about him, while she changed her expression with lightning speed. He would like to see new emotions on her face. Lanoli embarrassedly asked the prince for forgiveness and said that she would go. The prince grabbed her hand and told her to wait a little. The young lady was very surprised. She had a surprised look on her face as she was afraid that he might say something or hurt her. The prince looked at the young lady and asked if they could meet again. The crown prince walked up to Liam Lors and called him. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and responded. She was in shock because she didn't expect to see him after he invited her to meet again. She had a lot of things happen, and they couldn't talk in a blurred way. She wondered what he meant. The prince looked away and timidly asked the young man about his sister. The young lady was very frightened and wondered if he was angry because of his injury. She wondered if he meant that the young man would never see his sister again. The young lady was in shock. She prayed because she did not want to hear that the prince had decided to execute her for her misdeeds. The prince looked at the young man timidly as he wanted to ask about his sisters, but the young lady did not allow him to finish and asked his forgiveness for his sister's behavior. And she also said that the sister asked him to convey her apologies for hurting him. The prince looked at the young man in confusion and asked if the sister had really told him about him. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and said that it was so. Although it was she, the prince looked away in embarrassment. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she wondered if he was angry with her. The prince was shocked because looking at his friend, he noticed that they were indeed incredibly similar. Even if you look closely, he remembers Lanoli Lors. The prince was in shock. He did not understand why his heart was beating so loudly. He did not understand, since when next to him, his heart was beating like crazy. He understood that they were twins, so their faces were the same, but he was a guy. The prince understood that he simply liked the face of his friend's older sister. He smiled and thought that that was why his heart was beating so hard. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. She did not understand why he suddenly began to smile. She looked at him and said that Lanoli was very worried about the bruise. The prince shouted in surprise. Was Lanoli really worried about him? The young lady was shocked as she did not expect such a reaction from the prince. She was shocked and didn't understand why he was so surprised. She wondered if it was because she was worried about him that it was a surprise for the young lady. But looking at the prince, she noticed that he really wasn't angry with her. Arnold ran closer to her and, hugging her, greeted her. He said with a smile that they had not seen him since then. The young lady noticed that everyone had gathered near her. She greeted the young people. Eldek said that, at the ball, they could not really talk. They only exchanged pleasantries. The young lady looked at them as she knew that her brother would definitely say hello. Kyle looked at the young lady and said with a smile that someone was coming back. Linali looked at him in surprise because she did not understand what he was talking about. She asked who was returning. Arnold said with a smile that someone was returning, and now that he was with them, they would definitely win the battle of swords and magic. Arnold said with a smile on his face that the whole academy was already on edge. The young lady thought for a moment. She was calculating who had returned. Eldek said that this is a young talented knight. His sword skills are recognized not only by the academy, but also by the Order of the Royal Guard, so he entered both directions at the same time. He is listed as a student at the academy, but he is called a ghost student since he almost never appears in the institution due to his participation in various expeditions. The young lady wondered who it could be, as he is young and very talented. He is also called a student, a ghost. Kyle said with a smile that the young knight was the rival of the crown prince. The prince said that he was not his rival at all. He was just not that strong. The prince thought about everything for a moment. He knew that the young man should become the groom for Lena Loris. Arnold laughed. He said that this was the first time he had heard the crown prince admit defeat so easily. The young lady thought about everything. Kyle looked at her in surprise. A moment later, he came closer to her and asked what happened. She looked at everyone present and said that she simply did not understand who they were talking about. The young people were surprised, but looked at her. They did not expect that she would not know who they were talking about. Kyle looked at her in surprise and asked if she really didn't understand who she was talking about. He came closer to her and quietly said that they were talking about her fiance. The young lady was shocked by this news. She did not expect to hear something like that, and especially did not expect to meet her fiancé at the academy. Eldek said that Vergman should become the husband of his older sister. Eldek looked at Liam and asked if he really didn't know about this. The young lady was stunned by this news. She said that she knew everything very well, but this was the first time she had heard that he was returning. She was dumbfounded and said that it seemed to her that this was the case, and a letter had arrived from the family. Eldek looked at the young man and said that he must be very busy, but still he should read the letter as soon as possible. The young lady was shocked. She said that as soon as she returned to the dorm, she would immediately read the letter. She was in shock, did not understand what she should do when her fiancé returned. She understood that she would not be able to understand what was in his head, even though he was her fiancé. The young people were having fun on the trip, and at this time, the young lady was wondering what she should do. She understood that if he was participating in the battle of sword and magic, then he should definitely come to this expedition camp. She knew it was impossible to know what was in his head. She wondered if he would reveal her true colors. Agni told Liam, "Who thinks the camp will be a lot of fun?" He said that this is the first time he is going there with such anticipation, and yesterday he couldn't even sleep. Linali looked at her friend and said, "That's for sure." She understood that in fact this was not just a camp, but hard labor for her. Agni said that he was still sorry, of course, that Vergman senpai would not come. The young man sighed heavily and said that he had hoped that he would be able to train with the young talent. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked if he would not come. The young man said that Vergman is a very busy man. Agni looked at Liam and said that he knew him and should know all the details. The young lady was very happy and simply fluttered in seventh heaven with happiness, as she hoped that she would not meet her fiancé. She understood that he would finally be able to calm down and concentrate. Sometime later, they arrived at the camp and closely watched the lists. The young lady saw that the list said that there would be one room for two. She was shocked because she understood that she could not share the room with someone else. She was shocked because she didn't know that this would happen, because in the academy's dormitory, everyone had a personal room. She understood that the bathroom would be shared. She was shocked and didn't know what to do, since she didn't could wash with everyone else. The young man looked at his friend and said with a smile that they would live together and they would have a lot of fun. She understood that she was in the same room with a guy. This was no bad luck. She did not know what to do in this situation. Kyle approached the young lady and asked, "How about sleeping in the same room with him?" His friends were shocked by this statement from the young man. The crown prince looked at his friend and asked what kind of jokes these were. Kyle smiled and asked the prince if he himself was planning to sleep with Liam. A moment later, Kyle said that he was joking. The prince looked at the young man in bewilderment. The young lady looked at Kyle in surprise and asked why he made her such an offer. Kyle smiled and said that it was because he had a private bathroom in his room. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear something like that. But she also realized that they had private rooms and separate baths, like the representatives of facias. She understood that who could this is a good option, since Kyle knows that she is a girl, and she could take a bath alone. She knew it was less risky than sharing a room with her friend. But still, she understood that this was not very nice in relation to Agni. She pondered this situation carefully for some time. The prince looked at them with indignation, because he did not understand why they suddenly decided to live together. There is no need for this. The guy wondered why the young man was thinking about this for so long. The young lady was tormented. She didn't know what to do, since she understood that living in the same room with a guy was ugly. Kyle came closer to her and asked what she decided. He asked with a smile if she would live in the same room with him. A while later, Kyle opened the door with a smile and said that she could come in. He said that although the room was designed for one person, it was quite spacious. Kyle said that the crown prince stayed here last year, so the place was completely rebuilt. The young lady was shocked by the size of the room. She noticed that the bed was very large, albeit for one person. Kyle looked at her and asked what she would do as a thank you. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She looked at him in surprise and asked what kind of gratitude he was talking about. Kyle said with a smile that he was helping her only so that they would not find out that she was a girl, and she should immediately thank him for this. He said that besides, she refused to let him dance at the ball. The young lady was shocked by this statement. She understood that he was making her emotional again, but she was not going to follow his lead. She looked at him and asked what he wanted her to do. Kyle looked at her in surprise, but a moment later, he still noticed that she was a very interesting person. Initially, it was just to kill time. The young lady looked at him in surprise as he did not answer. A moment later, he threw her onto the bed. The young lady was taken aback, as she was in shock. Kyle looked at her and said that in this case, the next time you are with her partners at the ball, he would like to see only himself. He said that, of course, she must be in the guise of a girl. He very much now wanted her to belong only to him and no one else. Kyle wanted her to be his, and he had no intention of sharing even with the crown prince. The crown prince walked slowly and looked for Kyle's room. He knew that it was at the end of the corridor. He didn't like this idea at all. He thought about his friend and realized that he just had a beautiful face and nothing more. He understood that as crown prince, he was obliged to be privy to the affairs of his subjects. A moment later, he reached the room and was very surprised as the door was open. He heard Kyle say that they could take a bath together. The prince was shocked by what he saw and heard. The prince was taken aback and froze. He was in shock and did not understand what they were doing. Kyle looked at the young lady and said with a smile that everything was fine, since they had already seen each other naked. The prince was shocked by his words. The prince wondered what the two of them could do naked together, since they were both men. Dylan furiously decided to push all thoughts away and not think about it, since the mere thought made him feel sick. A moment later, he burst into the room and asked what they were doing there. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to see the prince. She saw that he was very embarrassed and angry. She did not know how to get out of such an incomprehensible situation. Kyle looked sideways at the prince and said that they were in the moment of something good. Kyle told the prince not to disturb them. The young lady was shocked by her friend's words. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand what Kyle was talking about. Lena understood that their behavior looked as strange as possible. The prince was shocked. He looked at them dumbfounded and asked if he had really bothered them. The prince angrily asked if this was the kind of relationship between them. Dylan angrily shouted that they were both men. The young lady looked at the prince and said that he had understood everything wrong. Kyle looked sideways at the prince and said that this had nothing to do with him. The young lady looked at Kyle in surprise. She didn't understand what he was thinking about. Dylan froze in indignation. He did not understand what was happening. The prince looked at them in surprise and dumbfounded, and asked if everything was mutual between them. Lena Lee angrily pushed Kyle away and said that he was just joking. Kyle said that he was not joking at all. The young lady looked at Kyle with great surprise. She did not expect to hear something like that. The prince noticed that Lawrence was not pleased with Kyle's behavior. Dylan wondered if Kyle was forcing him to do anything. Dylan understood that Kyle was a member of the fascias, and therefore Liam could not reject him. The prince wanted to help his friend avoid an incomprehensible situation. Dylan grabbed Liam by the hand and pulled him away from Kyle. The young lady was in shock. Kyle and the prince fought with their eyes. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand what was happening and why they were quarreling again. Eldick looked at everyone present and said that the training was over for today, and they should make sure that their bodies were properly rested. The young lady was very tired. They had training, so everything remained unclear. She wondered what she should do with their room since things didn't turn out the way she wanted. She noticed that a lot of people had gathered near the notice board. She did not understand what was happening, and she had a very bad feeling. The crown prince looked at everyone present and said that he had changed the room allocation and everyone should check their name. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise, as she did not expect him to do something like that. But a moment later, she saw that in the distribution that she was now in the same room with the prince. Lena Lee was shocked. She did not expect anything like this. She did not understand why everything turned out this way. Kyle looked at the prince in surprise and asked why Liam would live in the same room with him. He looked at Kyle differently and said that it was all because he decided that it would be dangerous for Liam to be in his presence. The prince said that he is obliged to protect his people, and this also applies to Lorenz. He is also his subject. Kyle frowned, and looking at the prince said that he could also be dangerous. The prince looked at his friend in surprise and asked what he said. Kyle said that apparently he just wanted to be in the same room with Liam. The crown prince was shocked. He was embarrassed and shouted and said that this was not the case. The prince thought for a moment about the young and beautiful lady. The prince sighed heavily and said that unlike Kyle, he liked girls. A moment later, Kyle turned around and said that he only liked girls too. The prince looked at the young man in surprise. He did not understand how to understand his words since his actions spoke of the opposite. The young lady was in shock. She didn't know what to do in this situation and didn't understand why she was in the room with the crown prince. She in turn didn't even want to get involved with him and didn't understand why everything turned out this way. The prince looked at the young lady and said that this room was definitely bigger than Kyle's room. Dylan told Liam that he could safely use the room. The young lady understood that the room was much larger, but she wondered if they would sleep together here. She looked at the bed in surprise. The prince said that it was nearby. She understood that the bed was in front of her, but there was only one of her. The prince said that the bed was large, and the two of them could fit on it without any problems. Lena Lee was shocked because she knew that this was the main problem, even if she was a man. How could she just sleep in the same bed next to the prince? She knew that the problem was that she would toss and turn in bed and might inadvertently touch the crown prince. She was shocked because she understood that in this case, she would definitely be executed. The young lady looked at the prince and said that she thought she would sleep on the sofa, and it would be more than enough. The prince looked at him and told him to calm down, as he would not pester him like Kyle did. The young lady shouted that this was not the case, and it was not like that at all. She understood that he was still mistaken about her connection with Kyle, and this irritated and infuriated her very much. The crown prince looked at Liam and told him to go to the bathroom first. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. She did not expect such behavior from him. She was shocked and looked at him and said that she couldn't go as he had to go first. The prince looked at his friend and told him not to think about it, since he had one more thing to do and could go after it. But still, she knew that this was wrong, and she couldn't just leave it like that. The crown prince looked at the young man and said that this was an order, and he was telling him to go first. The prince looked at the young man and asked if he understood. The young lady was shocked as she did not expect the prince to give her an order. She glanced sideways at the door to the bathroom and understood that she could not get rid of the order just like that. She understood that they would be separated by one door behind which she would be naked, and the door is located at a fairly large distance. Still, she thought that if she was more careful, then everything would be okay. She thanked the crown prince and said that, in that case, she would go. The prince furiously asked himself the question of what he was doing. The prince understood that his friend was the brother of Lena Lee Lores. He knew he had to protect her burden no matter what. Prim remembered the beautiful young lady whom he had previously told that he would like to meet again. He wondered when they would be able to do this. The young lady sighed heavily as she took a bath. She was glad that she could take a bath in a comfortable environment, but she still knew that she could not let her guard down. She understood that she must make sure that the fact that she was a girl was not revealed. For this reason, she had to sleep not on the bed, but on the sofa. Lost in her thoughts, she did not notice the spider. A moment later, but still she saw him and screamed very loudly. The crown prince almost fell out of his chair from the unexpected scream. He looked at the door in shock and shouted what happened. He was very worried and was eager to go to the bathroom. The prince froze in shock as he saw his friend naked. The prince looked at his friend in confusion, as he did not expect to see such a sight. The young lady was in shock. She didn't know what to do. The crown prince froze in place. He instinctively grabbed him and ended up a little more, and he was shocked to see him naked. In the blink of an eye, she pushed him out of the bathroom and apologized for it. The young lady was in shock. She knew that she had escaped, but she still wondered if he had exposed her. The crown prince was shocked. He did not understand what had just happened. She looked out the door. He looked at her in surprise. She looked at the prince and said that it was an accident, since she was very scared of the spider. She noticed the spider again on the ground and screamed very loudly. At the same time, she slammed the door. She screamed that there was a spider there, and she couldn't stand them. The poor prince was shocked by this behavior of the young man. He looked to the side in surprise and saw a spider on the ground. A moment later, the prince picked up the spider and threw it outside. The prince looked at the door and told his friend that he could go out as the spider was no longer there. She looked out the door shyly and asked if it was true. The young lady thanked the prince with a smile for helping her. The prince looked at his friend dumbfounded. After all that had happened, the prince went to take a bath. He sighed heavily. He remembered with a smile what happened and realized that his friend was afraid of insects. But still, he was very surprised when he saw him in a very indecent form. The prince thought embarrassedly that his friend was very soft, fair skin and delicate curves. His body reminded him of a girl's body. The prince was shocked. He did not understand why he was imagining something like that, since he was a guy from head to toe. The prince wondered if he should be surprised that Kyle liked him, but still he could not understand their intentions, since he understood that they were both men. He wondered how this was even possible. The crown prince was a little lost in his thoughts and thought about the young lady. He was shocked and decided that he still needed to come to his senses and throw away all unnecessary thoughts. He realized that he had had enough of bathing and needed to go out. Out of habit, he called the servant and told him to bring a towel. But later he realized that there was no one today. He looked into the distance in embarrassment as he realized that today only the two of them were left in the room. He was in shock and did not understand why he was so worried. He understood that his friend was a guy. As he came out, he saw a young man sitting on the sofa. The young lady looked at the prince and said that she would like to talk about what happened recently. She called him because she noticed that he was acting very strange. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and asked what was happening to him. She noticed that his body was very hot. The young lady called the prince but saw that he did not answer her. A moment later, they fell onto the bed with a crash. Lenalee was shocked as she realized that her scream just now sounded very similar to a woman's. She looked at the prince in surprise and called him. She realized that he was dizzy since he had been sitting in the hot bath for a very long time. She screamed for him to come to his senses, and she also said that she would bring him water now. Without raising his head, the prince told her not to leave. The prince looked at his friend and told him not to leave. At the same time, the prince clearly saw the young lady. Hugging her, he said that he really wanted to see her. The young lady looked at the prince in shock. She was very embarrassed. The prince said that he constantly thought about their imminent meeting. Lenalee was in shock. She understood that it seemed like Dinal mistook her for Lenalee. In fact, it was so, but still she was very surprised and embarrassed because she did not understand why he was behaving this way. He looked at the young lady and said embarrassedly that since that day he could not get her out of his mind. The young lady was shocked. From such a statement, she did not understand why he could not get her out of his mind. She was in shock and did not understand his behavior at all. Ono looked at him in embarrassment. A moment later, she noticed that the prince had fallen asleep on her feet. She noticed that his heart was beating very fast. The young lady understood that the prince was the man who executed her entire family, including her. She understood that she should not let her guard down because of her feelings. The prince woke up and did not notice how morning came. He wondered in surprise to himself when he had fallen asleep in the first place. For a moment, he remembered the young lady. In a hurry, he sat down on the bed, as he remembered that yesterday, Lenali Laures was next to him. Turning around, he saw his friend who was sleeping soundly and drooling. The crown prince looked at his friend in surprise. He realized that this was not the girl of his dreams, but only her brother. He remembered that he felt bad yesterday, and he immediately fell asleep. The crown prince wondered how a guy who sleeps in such a ridiculous position and drools could be a girl. He realized that he had a very wonderful dream yesterday. Lenali walked down the corridor, yawning. She remembered last night. Lenali was confused. The whole situation seemed very bad to her. She did not know what to do. As a result, she slept on the bed with the crown prince. She understood that if her father found out about this, he would simply kill her. Besides, she thought yesterday that he had exposed her. She was sure he still remembered that moment, judging by the way he acted this morning. The young lady was taken aback and dumbfounded as she thought of something. She wondered if he wanted to meet her to execute her. She understood that because of the fever, he simply could not find the right words. She wondered how she could not have thought of this right away. The young lady entered the training ground and settled down as all eyes were on her. The young lady was shocked as she heard different whispers. The boys were whispering that he liked boys and said that he had not only gotten to Mr. Kyle, but also to the crown prince. They said that it was a real disgrace for their academies. She didn't really hear what was said, but she felt the tense atmosphere. The young people discussed this topic and were very angry since they were selected based on their strength, and it was enough for him to simply sleep with the leadership. Agni saw his friend Liam and ran towards him with a smile. Lenali saw her friend and was very happy. She greeted him with a smile. Agni looked at Liam and said with his smile that he was very glad that he was okay. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Agni said that he suddenly found himself in the same room with His Majesty. Although they did not have a very good relationship, Agni said that he was worried about his friend all night, because he thought that something might happen to him. The young lady froze in surprise, but later she happily thanked her friend for what he was worried about. The young man looked at his friend in surprise and embarrassment. A moment later, he looked away embarrassedly and said that he rarely smiled so sweetly. The young lady froze in bewilderment. Agni said with a smile that it was nothing special, and he would now go drink water and come. Kyle looked sideways at the young people. Kyle looked sideways at the crown prince and said that because Dylan was clinging to Liam, he was again becoming the subject of various rumors. The crown prince looked at his friend in surprise and asked what he was talking about since he did not know about any rumors. Kyle smiled and turned around and told the crown prince that he didn't seem to be the smart one. The crown prince looked at him dumbfounded. A moment later, Dylan shouted to Kyle and asked what he meant. Eldick shouted to everyone to gather as they were starting training. Eldick commanded everyone and gave out instructions. The crown prince looked angrily in his direction since he did not hear the answer to the question because of him. Agni and Lenali fought a fierce battle among themselves. The young lady shouted to her friend that he had opened up. With the speed of lightning, she turned around and came behind him, hitting him in the process. A moment later, the young man fell to the ground with a crash. The young lady said with a smile that victory today was hers. The young man was shocked and very angry, because for a second, he thought that he was finally able to defeat his friend. The young lady walked up to him and said that, to be honest, he was very close, and his sword skill had improved significantly. Agni, with a smile on his face, looked embarrassed at his friend and asked if he was serious about this. He said that lately even his body has become lighter. Agni looked at his friend and asked if he wasn't skinny, and he also asked if he was eating well. Linley smiled and said that she had always had a problem with gaining muscle mass. She couldn't tell him that it was all because that she's actually a girl. Agni looked at his friend and said with a smile that he would like to fight him one more time. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and told him to rest a little first. Agni said that this would not work, since he needed to continue until he forgot these sensations. But a moment later, fire appeared in the sky, and a loud explosion was heard. The lady froze in surprise, and turning around, she saw a fire above her head. She heard someone calling her. Lena Lee opened her eyes. Turning around, she saw someone's silhouette and was very surprised. The young lady was shocked, because upon closer inspection, she realized who it was. The young man looked at her and asked if she was okay. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand where he came from here. She wondered if they had not told her before that the young man would not come to the competition. Her fiance, Rich Wergman, appeared before her in all his glory. The young lady turned around because she heard someone calling her in a hurry. The crown prince looked at the young man dumbfounded. Angie ran up to his friend and asked if he was okay. Eldick told everyone to be careful. Agni looked at Liam and asked if he was hurt an hour. Linnaeus said in a trembling voice that she was fine and was not hurt. Arnold looked at his friend with a smile and said that he had arrived after all. Rich noticed that the young lady's leg was injured, and he quickly grabbed it and threw it on his shoulder. Lenalee was in shock. She shouted to her fiancé what he was up to, and also asked what came over him suddenly. The young lady shouted to her groom, but he carried her without listening. Arnold looked at them in surprise and said that his friend was very fast. She screamed at him to let her go so she could walk on her own. A moment later, he threw her on the bed. She looked around the room in surprise and said that this was not a first aid post. She also asked why he brought her here without looking back at her. He said that her leg was injured. She looked at her leg in surprise since she did not notice at all that it was injured. The young lady looked at her fiancé in surprise. Lena wondered if he had brought her here because of a simple scratch. She noticed that, as always, there was not a single emotion on his face. She sighed heavily as she understood that he did not seem to understand who she really was. He asked what she was doing here while he called her by name. The young lady was taken aback as she realized that she had been exposed. She was in shock because of this. Lena noticed his menacing and serious gaze. The young man looked intently at his future wife with bewilderment. Looking away, she asked what he meant. Rich told her not to pretend, as he would recognize her smell from 1,000. He looked away from her, sighing heavily. The young lady was in shock because she could not understand how he recognized her by her smell. But if you think about it, she knew about her future groom's scent since childhood. Rich said that as soon as he returned from the expedition, he immediately went to see her, but she wasn't at the estate. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She did not expect that he could do such a thing. She was shocked, since they became a couple, only by the decision of their parents. She always thought that he himself was not interested in her. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked why it was not her younger brother, who was here now, but she. The young lady hesitated a little, as she did not know how to answer this question correctly. She wondered what she should do since she had been completely figured out. She understood that she urgently needed to come up with something. She looked at the young man and said that she too would like to become a knight. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise. He was shocked by this statement. The young lady sighed heavily and said that this is exactly how it is looking at him. She asked if it was fair that only her brother had such an opportunity. Lena Lee said, with a smile, that she could become a knight too. She looked at him and said that, for this reason, she and her father agreed that they would switch with their brother for at least 1 year. Rich angrily told her to come home now. Lena Lee was shocked by such a statement, but of course she assumed that he would say something like that. Lena Lee angrily shouted that she did not want to go back there. Rich looked at the young lady and told her to pack her things immediately, since this was not the best place to have a good time. The young lady was dumbfounded by such a statement. She looked at the young man and said that she did not consider being here as something pleasant. The young lady said she was serious and wasn't going to give up and run away. She was here to change her future and to protect her family. She didn't want him to tell her that it was for her amusement. Lenali understood that she had no choice and had to fight to the end. Rich looked at her and, sighing heavily, said that she was as stubborn as before. He said that, be that as it may, she should prepare to leave, and at the academy he himself would sort everything out and tell her. The young lady was in shock. She did not know what to do, since at this rate she would be sent home. She remembered the conversation with her brother, who told her that her fiancé could find out about everything, and she needed to think of something. She understood that she had no way out and had to fight to the end. Liam looked at his sister in surprise and asked if she was serious when she said she would dress like a man. He asked if she was sure that she would succeed. Lena Lee said with a smile that she was sure that she could handle everything. He looked at her and asked what she would do if they were discovered. He looked at his sister and said that he was sure that if she met her fiance, he would immediately reveal her. Liam said about his sister that her fiance could spot her by smell. The young lady was taken aback. She looked at her brother and said that she had not seen him for many years, so there was nothing to worry about. Liam said that she still needs to worry, and if he recognizes her, then something needs to be done. He looked at his sister and said that she should listen to him carefully. Liam looked at his sister and said that if her fiancé recognized her, then she would not be able to do anything but should say the following. The young lady listened intently to her brother. Lena Lee wondered for a moment whether she should tell all this to her fiancé. She realized that she had no choice at all. She didn't know if this would help her, but she still decided to say, looking at her fiancé. She called him. Lena Lee looked at him intently and shouted with rage that if he told everything at the academy, then she would not marry him. Rich froze in surprise, as he did not expect her to say something like that. He looked at her, dumbfounded and furious. He was hurt by such words. He looked at her and said that he could not allow her to live surrounded by men. The young lady said that it was only for 1 year, and she had already agreed on everything with her father. Taking his hand, she begged him to let her, and not reveal her secret. He looked at her with a pitiful look and asked if she could promise him that after that she would marry him. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise. She looked at him and said that she promised this, so now she asks him to be allowed to be here until this moment. He looked at her and said that he agreed with this, and they could agree. The young ladies looked at him in surprise as they realized that she had won, but she was still surprised and wondered if the words, "I won't marry," were so effective. But still, she was very surprised by the fact that the young man really wanted this marriage. She thought earlier that he would not care whether he was with her or with someone else. But still, she understood that the main thing now is that everything worked out for her, and now she can stay at the academy. Sometime later, Rich was sparring with a knight from the academy. Rich struck a victorious blow, and the king's sword flew out of his hands. Arnold looked at the sparring and said with a smile that as he thought victory would be for Rich. Arnold understood that this was called art with a sword. He understood that such strength at his age was too much. The young lady looked closely at her future groom, as she noticed that he was in the crowd of knights. She was very glad that she managed to persuade her future groom, but she was very surprised because he was extremely popular. She understood that it seemed that he was not called a young genius for nothing. She was not even surprised that her friend praised him and admired him. From the moment they signed the contract, the young man was busy with active work on the front line. And after that false accusation, their engagement was called off, and they grew apart, so she didn't really know anything about him. However, she recalled that he was weaker than her as a child. The young man fell heavily to the ground with a crash. The young lady came closer to him and looked at him with a smile. She smiled and said that this time the victory was hers again. Rich was very upset and even cried. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was crying again. Lena Lee said that he was very whiny. The young man looked away from her and cried a little. She looked at him in surprise. A moment later, he asked if she liked strong people. She looked at him with a smile and said that this is so. Since the man is strong, physically and mentally, this is her dream. The young lady was about to leave when suddenly he called her. Looking at the young lady in embarrassment, he shouted that he would not cry anymore, and he will train a lot to become stronger than her. She remembered those childhood moments and realized that he was very sweet then. To look back, he had already grown up and gained strength. But in her head, he remained the same crybaby that he was in those days. Even though he is now a completely different person, she was a little sad because she understood that now she was not his rival at all. The crown prince looked at the young man and said that it was time for them to go to the room. Rich looked at the crown prince in surprise and asked why His Highness needed Liam. The prince looked at the young man and said that it was probably because they lived together. Richard froze in surprise. He was very angry at what he heard. He looked at the young man and asked why he was in the same room with His Majesty. Rich looked at Liam and said that he was just the son of the Marquis. Rich looked at them and said that his status did not correspond to that of a prince in order to live together. The prince angrily said that it seemed to him that there was no point in attaching importance to such things. Here Dylan looked at Rich and said that this had nothing to do with him. Rich said with rage that this whole situation had a direct bearing on him, since the young man was the younger brother of his fiancée. Rich came closer to the prince and said that for this reason, he would look after the young man. Dylan was shocked by such a statement. Lanely was not shocked by this whole situation. She wondered why they were both so serious. She understood that she was just having some kind of déjà vu, since a similar situation had already happened with Kyle. She knew that the two didn't seem to get along very well. Sometime later, the young lady entered the room with her fiancé. Lanali saw a modest room. Rich said he would sleep somewhere else so she could stay here. She looked at him in surprise, but she thanked him with a smile and wished him good night. Lanali wondered, since I was very interested in her, if he cared about her, just because she was a girl. Rich was very surprised when his bride ended up in such a place. He was shocked, but at the same time he admired her, since he liked her very much. He found out that the sun of the last day they met, she became even more beautiful. She was very beautiful and beautiful with long hair, but short hair suited her very well too. He knew that the young lady was always beautiful, but he was still shocked and very annoyed that she actually lived here among men. He understood that she was charming even in this guise, and he was very worried about the fact that she very much attracted the attention of different guys. He understood that he became stronger in order to protect her. He was furious as he realized that he did not intend to give it to anyone. The tense interruption in the camp came to an end, and they returned to the academy. Agni looked at his friend and asked if the practice was over. He said that he was even a little sad as he missed the camp. A moment later, they heard some noise. Agni looked at the other side in surprise and asked what was happening there. Lanely was no less surprised, since she did not know what had happened. The young lady looked to the side in surprise as she noticed her future grooms. She understood that to see him as he was studying at the academy, he would appear and disappear, so no one knew exactly when he was at the academy. Agni looked at his friend in surprise and asked if Bergman also worked as a security guard. The young lady thought about it and said that it seemed so. A moment later, they heard a woman scream. The young lady looked at the girl with fury and asked if she really wanted to die since she was wearing the same ribbon as hers. The girl was scared, looked at the young lady and asked for forgiveness. From her, Sicily was furious, said that the girl was pissing her off, and she also told her to get out of her sight. The young lady with tears in her eyes asked her forgiveness for her ignorance. Sicily looked sideways at the young lady and said that she seemed to have no idea where she was. Agni looked at his friend stunned and asked if he knew who was screaming. Lanely was shocked and said that this was the first time she had seen the young lady. Lanali thought for a moment. She had the feeling that she had already heard about the young lady somewhere, but unfortunately, she could not remember where she had heard about it. A moment later, they heard a noise and looked into the distance. Phasis walked slowly in the gathering. Everyone said that the young people were simply incredible as always. The young lady quickly changed her mood and told the crown prince with a smile that she really wanted to see him. The crown prince looked at her in surprise, but did not answer. A moment later, he looked at her angrily and asked what she had forgotten there. The young lady looked at him and said with a smile that starting tomorrow, she will temporarily study at this academy. She walked closer to him with a smile and wanted to touch his hand. She asked if he would show her everything here, but the crown prince took his hand and pulled away from it. The young lady was shocked by this behavior of the young man. She looked at him intently and angrily, as she was very upset by his behavior. The crown prince looked at his friends and said that it was time for them to go. Arnold looked at the prince and said with a smile that he was behaving as usual, and Miss Sicily was still as frisky. Eldick looked at the crown prince and said that only her future groom could cross her thoughtless actions. Looking at the prince, he said that only he could calm her down. The Black Prince looked at his friends and said that he got engaged to her not because he was in love with her, so if this was necessary, they could take retaliatory measures themselves. Kyle looked at the prince in surprise and said that he would not do anything. Lanely looked at the prince and his retinue in surprise. Sicily screamed at the crown prince to stop. Now Lanely remembered that Sicily was the crown prince's fiancée. Sicily screamed after them to stop. Sicily is an arrogant girl who tramples to smithereens people she doesn't like. If you cross her path, access to social events will be closed forever. This is where she got her nickname Poisonous Flower. The young lady understood that she had one strategy in this regard: to face her. Linala did not want to, because she understood that trouble could not be avoided. She understood that it was better for this reason to simply avoid her and not approach her. The next day, the young lady walked leisurely about her business. She saw the prince and Mrs. Sicily walking arm in arm. Sicily looked at the prince and asked with a smile if he would like to have lunch together today. Lenely glanced sideways at the pair of young men. She knew she needed to stay away from them. The crown prince looked at his friend and embarrassedly shouted and called out to him. The lady was shocked. She was scared because the prince shouted. The prince pulled his hand away from the young lady and, looking at his friend, said that everything was wrong. Linali froze in surprise. She did not understand what was happening. She looked at the prince in surprise because she did not understand what was happening and why he was screaming so much. Dylan angrily yelled at Liam to get him right. Of course she was his fiance, but that wasn't the case. He wanted his friend to listen to him. The prince looked at the young man and told him not to think anything unnecessary. The young lady looked at the prince in bewilderment. She did not understand what was happening and why he was behaving this way. Sicily looked sideways at the embarrassed prince. Sicily did not understand what was going on. The ex's crown prince, and he didn't understand what he was even doing, and why, at the moment, everything looked like he was making excuses for his friend Sicily, looked at the crown prince and said that they had to go already, otherwise they would be late for class. Dylan pulled his hand back and looked angrily at his companion. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. She stumbled and fell down. Everyone was scared. Linali was in shock. She rushed after the young lady and shouted for her to be careful. And the crown prince in turn shouted to his friend as he fell down. Linali looked at Sicily and asked if she was okay. Sicily looked at Liam in surprise and said everything was okay. Linali was very glad that it was not very high, and everything worked out. The crown prince rushed to his friend and asked if he was okay. Linali looked at my prince and timidly said that everything was fine with her. Dylan sighed heavily and told him not to scare him anymore like that. Sicily looked at the young people in surprise. She did not understand why the crown prince behaved this way towards his friend. She was shocked and wondered why he was not worried about her in the first place, but about his friend. Linali looked at the prince and said that there was nothing anywhere, and so that everything was in perfect order. Dylan looked at the young man and said with a smile that this was very good, and he was very glad that everything worked out. For some time, they carried on a casual conversation, and at the same time, the prince looked intently at the young man with a smile on his face. Sicily was shocked by what she saw. Sicily went outside. She was shocked because she didn't understand the situation. She didn't understand why the crown prince didn't go up to his bride and ask if she was okay. The young lady screamed furiously that she should have been his priority. She was furious because she knew he had never smiled like that. The young lady's son furiously wondered who he even was. She understood that he made a sweet face, and the crown prince immediately melted. Sicily screamed that she would not forgive him, as she did not like him right away. The man approached her from behind and asked if she really wanted to get rid of him. The young lady looked in surprise and shouted who it was. A moment later, she turned around and saw a man who hid his face behind his hood. The man looked at her and said that he was offering her a deal, and she would just have to follow his instructions. The young lady froze as she did not understand who this man was and why he was offering her a deal. She looked at him and asked if he could really help her deal with that guy. The man said with a grin that everything was exactly like that, and he would help her. For a moment, she wondered if she should accept the help of a stranger. She looked at him and said that then he could lead her up to date. Linali walked slowly through the academy. She was lost in her thoughts and did not notice anyone. A moment later, she heard someone calling her and turned around. Sicily smiled at the young man and asked if he was training right now. She looked at him with a smile and asked if he would mind if she walked with him a little. Linali froze in surprise, but still agreed with the young lady's proposal. The young lady was confused. She couldn't believe that Sicily was interested in someone other than the Prince Linala, wondered why the young lady suddenly paid attention to her. Moreover, recently, her attention became too obvious, and there was a lot of it. Linali looked at the young lady warily and wondered what she even wanted from her. Sicily timidly looked at the young man and asked for forgiveness. Lenily looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what happened. Sicily looked at the young man and timidly said that there was actually something she would like to tell him. A moment later, looking at the young man, she said that she could not say this here since she would like to go with him to another place. Sometime later, they retired to the office, and the guards stood at the entrance. Lenily looked at the young lady and asked what it was that she wanted to talk to her about. The young lady looked at Liam shyly and timidly. She didn't know how to talk to him. A moment later, she looked at the young man and said with a smile that she had fallen in love with him. Lenali froze in place in surprise. She did not understand what was happening at all and did not understand how to react to this. Lenali looked at the young lady in surprise as she couldn't believe that Lady Sicily had fallen in love with her. Lenali was shocked to realize what the young lady had said. Lenali said in shock that Sicily was the bride of His Highness the Prince. Sicily said that it was true, and Mr. Dillon really loved her with all his heart. Sicily said that he still constantly reminds her of his love, but unfortunately, she cannot reciprocate his feelings. Lenali was frozen in shock. She didn't understand what was going on and why the young lady was telling her something like that. Lenali couldn't believe the young lady's words, as she knew that the crown prince was cold towards her, and she wondered if he was constantly reminding her of his love, as she knew that was not true. Lenali was in shock and did not understand what was happening. Lenali looked at the young lady in surprise as she muttered something. Sicily said that the one she fell in love with was only Mr. Liam. She grabbed the young man by the hand and pulled him closer to her. Lenali was shocked by the young lady's actions. Sicily slowly unbuttoned her outerwear. A moment later, she unbuttoned her outer garment and screamed furiously. Lenali was shocked by what the young lady had done. Sicily screamed with rage for someone to save her and come to her aid. The guards burst into the room and looked at everything that was happening in surprise and asked Lady Sicily what happened to her. In Sicily, I stood in line, covered the upper part of my body, and embarrassed with tears in my eyes, looked away. The guards were in shock. They could not believe what was happening. The guards furiously rushed at the young man. They could not believe how he dared to do this to his mistress. They shouted for him to immediately move away from her. Lenali was in shock. She shouted for them to wait a little, since everything was not as they saw. A moment later, the guard attacked the young man. The young lady was in shock. She did not understand what was happening and why Mrs. Sicily did this. Sicily angrily screamed at the guards to grab this guy soon. Lenali was shocked because she realized that the young lady had simply set her up. She understood that at this rate, she would immediately be sent to jail because of her false accusation. She understood that she needed to do something to gain time. Lenali understood that things were very bad, since she could not cope with two guards at the same time. A moment later, her fiance came running to her aid. The young lady looked at her companion in surprise. Lenali called her fiance. She was glad that he came to her aid. Sicily looked at everything that was happening in surprise. She did not expect such a turn of events. Rich looked at the guards with rage and said that first they would have to deal with him. With lightning speed, he dealt with the guards. Lenali was in shock, but she also understood that she was now saved. She looked at her fiancé and thanked him. A moment later, the crown prince entered the office and angrily asked what was happening here. Lenali was surprised to see the crown prince. A few minutes later, she saw that he had not come alone, but with his friends. Sicily rushed to him with tears in her eyes. She hugged him, and with tears in her eyes, said that she was very scared because she was suddenly attacked by Mr. Lorse. Sicily said with rage that she was after all his fiancé, and he suddenly began to let go of his hands. Sicily said that she didn't give him any permission or reason to behave this way. Lenali froze in place with shock. Lenali understood that the situation was bad, and even if she said that it was not so, they would probably not believe her words. She wondered in fear what kind of punishment awaited her for attacking the prince's fiancé. She understood that in the worst-case scenario, her family would also be held accountable. Lenali was shocked because she understood that she tried all the time, but nothing worked out for her. She understood that she could not escape from fate. Lenali looked at the young lady dumbfounded. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know what would be taken against her. Sicily said with rage that she heard that the young man was pestering other student boys and seducing them. She shouted that he was dirty, a homosexual. Lena was shocked by such a statement from Sicily. She did not expect her to say something like that. Sicily, in turn, screamed and wondered how such a person could even be in the academy under the leadership of the prince himself. Sicily shouted to the crown prince that this was a blow to his authority, and this guy should be expelled from the academy immediately. The crown prince looked at the young man and said that he was his friend. Linali froze in shock at the prince's words. The prince looked at the young lady and said that from now on, he would take every word spoken against him against himself. Linali was shocked that the prince believed her and not his future bride. Sicily looked at the prince in surprise. She didn't expect the prince to say something like that. The prince looked at the young lady and asked what she said about his authority. The crown prince looked at her furiously and asked if she really thought that his authority could be damaged by something like that. The young lady froze in surprise. She did not expect him to behave like this. The crown prince looked at the young lady and said with rage that even though unfortunately she was his fiance, he was insulting himself and would not allow it. Sicily was shocked, she said in a trembling voice, that she did not want to insult him at all. The crown prince looked at her and said gloomily that with the power given to him as the crown prince, he would immediately carry out her sentence. The young lady was taken aback by such a statement from the prince. Everyone froze in place at this statement. From the crown prince, the young lady was trembling with fear. She looked at the prince and asked what kind of sentence he was talking about. She shouted to the crown prince that everything was not as he understood. Sicily screamed that she was forced, and she did nothing. But a moment later, she was affected by a spell that was cast on her by a strange man. She was trembling as she wanted to tell the crown prince everything, but she couldn't. Out of despair, she fell to the ground and trembled in front of everyone. Lena froze in place after hearing the verdict from the crown prince. She remembered her past life and how the crown prince executed her entire family and killed her. Standing still, she trembled with fear. She could not believe everything that was happening. The crown prince came closer to her and called out to her. The crown prince looked at his friend and asked how he was feeling. The young lady was taken aback with fear. She remembered her past life and how he executed her with a grin. She screamed angrily and pushed his hand away. The crown prince looked at his friend in surprise. He did not expect such a reaction. Everyone froze in place in surprise. They did not understand why the young man was behaving this way. She was very scared, standing still. She cried because she was afraid that execution would await her again. She could not allow this to happen. The crown prince was shocked. He looked at his friend and asked why he was crying. Lena furiously screamed at him to stop and not kill them. Rich yelled at Liam to watch his words immediately. Rich approached the crown prince and bowing said that he asked for his forgiveness. Rich said he would immediately interview the young man. Rich grabbed the young lady's hand and said it was time for them to go. Prince Dylan froze in shock as he just wanted to help his friend. He did not understand why he reacted so violently to his touch. The young lady was shocked and confused. She did not understand why everything turned out this way again. The crown prince was furious because he understood that he was to blame for what had happened. He shouted with rage that he had gone too wild again. He looked furiously at the young lady who was sitting on the ground and said that the execution was cancelled and told her to be taken to prison immediately. Arnold looked at the prince and called him as he wanted to stop him. The prince looked at his friend with rage and told him not to touch him. Elena looked at the prince and said that he was very angry. Arnold asked the crown prince to cool down a little. Kyle looked at everything that was happening in surprise. Kyle understood that this bad habit of the crown prince had come out again. He suddenly lost track of the whole situation and rushed forward at full speed, causing pain not only to himself, but also to those close to him. Kyle thought for a moment as he remembered that the crown prince had a similar expression on his face that day. Kyle realized that when the crown prince met Liam, he became less explosive and more calm. Kyle hoped that the old crown prince would not interfere with the present. The young lady sat quietly in the dungeon. A moment later, she heard someone's voice. The man came closer to her and said that she was very pathetic. The young lady turned around in surprise and saw a man in a hood. She was in shock and about the task, but looked at him and asked how he ended up here. The man said with a grin that with his magic, it couldn't be easier. Sicily screamed angrily for him to get her out of here now. She screamed that it was all because of him, and that what happened to her was his fault. He came closer to her and said that she herself made this choice, since earlier she almost told the crown prince about him. He looked at her and said with rage that the bad girl deserves to be punished. He cast a spell on her. A moment later, a bright light surrounded the young lady and a spell wrapped around her neck. She was in shock and did not understand what he had done to her. The man looked at her and said with a smirk that he had simply placed a curse on her. The young lady froze in place in shock. The man said that if she tried to tell them the truth, the curse would immediately activate and kill her. He slowly left her and finally told her that she herself was to blame for everything. The young lady, sitting on the ground, dumbfounded, looked after him. Rich came to his bride and knocked on the door. The young lady looked out from behind the doors in surprise, as she did not expect to see her fiancé. He looked at her and asked for forgiveness for coming so suddenly. He said that he was soon going on an expedition with a knightly order, so he came to see her before leaving. The young lady froze in place. She looked at him and asked for forgiveness for what happened recently. She said that she did not know what had come over her then. She said with a smile that everything was fine with her now. He looked at her and asked if she would really go home for the summer holidays. He said that when he returned from the expedition, he would definitely visit her. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect that he would want to visit her. He looked at her and told her not to forget something. Rich looked at the young lady and said that no matter what happened, he would always be on her side. A moment later, he left, leaving her alone. She was confused, as he was not expected to care for her. She did not expect him to have his sweet side. She wondered why he was suddenly planning to visit his parents' house. After he left, she returned to her room. She thought for a moment about the situation that had happened. She knew that Lady Sicily had been released from prison, but it was said that she was under a high-level curse that prevented her from telling the truth about what happened. Therefore, Lenny was still confused and did not know why the young lady did this to her. Sicily only said that she was forced to do this, but unfortunately, the alleged perpetrator was never found. The young lady wondered if this could be the same person who slipped the poison at the tea party, or if someone else was involved in this situation. The young lady was very alarmed by this situation. In addition, she understood that she had lost control and behaved terribly towards the prince. At that moment, she took out all her anger on him. Since then, they have never seen each other. She still understood that the crown prince had executed her entire family, and he even wanted to behead his own bride. She thought that it would be better for her not to get involved with the crown prince. The young lady wondered if this would be the right decision in this situation. The young lady said with a smile that she had packed everything and just had to remember to take these things home with her. A moment later, she remembered the crown prince. A lot has happened in the past couple of months. She was shocked and embarrassed, wondering why she only remembered the crown prince. A moment later, she heard some knocking on the window. Turning around, she saw the bird and was very surprised. The young lady noticed that it was not a simple bird, but a magical one. She was wondering what happened so that she received the letter. She wondered if she would really have to return later than planned. She thought that most likely her father would probably shed tears. She saw the letter and was horrified, as her brother wrote that they were in trouble, and wondered why His Highness the Crown Prince had come to visit her. At the same time, the Crown Prince said that he would not leave the estate until he saw her. He wrote that he would try to distract him somehow, but still asked her to come immediately as soon as possible. Lena Lee was in shock. She did not understand why the prince came to her and what he wanted from her. She still hoped that he had not come to them in order to execute her for pushing him away. The young lady was taken aback by the realization of the situation. The situation seemed very strange to her, since he deliberately came to her as to Lena Lee. She was shocked because her brother wrote that she should return quickly, but it would take her half a day or even more to get home. She wondered what she should do. She understood that she could return in an instant with the help of displacement magic, but she did not own magic. She wondered who could use it. A moment later, she remembered that there is one person from the academy who has access to high-level magic. Kyle was sitting in the room and quietly reading a book, but a moment later, the young man heard a knock on the door. He looked at the door in surprise. The butler came to his room and said that he had a guest. Kyle looked at the butler in surprise and said that he was going to go home today, so he didn't make an appointment with anyone. He said that he didn't want anyone to bother him, and so Kyle told the butler to say that he was here. "There is no one." The butler hesitated, and looking at the gentleman, said that the fact was that this guest was his man, that is his junior comrade. Kyle looked at the butler in surprise and asked who came to him. A moment later, the butler said that the young man introduced himself as Liam Loris. Kyle was surprised and froze in place. In surprise, the young man dropped the book to the ground. He looked at the butler and said that he could immediately tell who came to him. Kyle thanked the butler and said that he would talk to the guest himself. The young lady was quietly waiting for her friend in the corridor. Kyle came out and, looking at the young lady, asked her what happened in a way he did not expect to see her at all. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she wanted to ask him for help. She ran up to him and, grabbing his hands with tears in her eyes, asked for forgiveness for suddenly showing up to him, but she asked him for help. Lena Lee said that she had one request for him, and her life depended on it. Kyle looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect such behavior from the young lady. He came closer to her and asked what kind of request she was talking about. He looked at her and said with a grin that in that case, the price for her life must be quite high. The young lady froze, looking at the young man. Until recently, Kyle was very worried about the young lady and her state of health, but he could notice now that she was much better than before. He looked at her and asked with a grin what they would do together with her. She looked at him in surprise as his words shocked her. She understood that she had to pay him somehow, since he is one of the most influential people in the academy. She looked at him and said that she would do everything. She shouted that she would do everything in her power, so she would like to ask him for help. The young man sighed heavily, looking away from her. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she wondered if he had expected a different reaction from her. Kyle looked at her and sighed heavily. He said that her naivety frightened him very much. He said that she agrees to literally anything with such ease. He looked at her and said that she should think more rationally. Kyle looked at her and asked if she understood his words. He sighed heavily and said that it was clear from her face that she did not understand what he was talking about now. He came closer to her and said with a grin that this is exactly the meaning he puts into the concept of a high price. The young lady shuddered as he came too close to her. She pushed him away and moved away because she really did not like such closeness. Kyle looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked if she now understood what he wanted from her. Kyle looked at the young lady and said that he was still keeping her secret. He asked if she thought it was time to pay the bills. Kyle looked at her and said with a grin that he wouldn't mind if she paid with a kiss, for example. The young lady looked at him in confusion and shock. She understood that in fact he had helped her out many times, but still the kiss was too much. She looked at him and said that was too much. Kyle smiled and asked, "What about asking for her life?" The young lady pulled back and looked at him confused. Kyle looked at her and with a sly smile asked if she was even worth her kiss. The young lady's face drooped as she truly said that her life depended on this request. Kyle looked at her and said that he was the only one she asked for help every time. The young lady looked at him and said that then she would dance with him at the next ball. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise. She shouted that she promised and would certainly dance with him. He was shocked by such a statement from the young lady, as he did not expect to hear such a thing from her. She looked at him and asked, "How about it, is this price right for him?" He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to dance with him. He sighed heavily and said that he was in full swing. The young lady looked at him in surprise. He said with a smile that he saw that her former energy had already returned. He smiled and said that this time he would give in to her. The young lady was simply in seventh heaven as she understood that her global problem would be solved in an instant. Kyle looked at her and asked what she wanted him to do. The young lady asked him to carry her home. Kyle looked at her in surprise and asked if this was all, since earlier she had said that her life depended on this request. In a hurry, she began to say the reason for such a request, but without finishing the sentence, she stopped. For a moment, she thought about everything and still thought that it was better for him not to know about the prince's arrival at her home. She understood that there was no need to tell him about this, since she understood that when fate brought the two of them together, something strange was sure to happen. Kyle looked at the young lady in surprise. She was taken aback and said that it was nothing. Kyle realized that it was better for him not to focus on such things and said that he would send her now. The young lady thanked him with a smile. Kyle looked at her and told her not to leave the magic circle. The young lady smiled and said that she understood him. She sighed heavily as she thanked the gods that everything had worked out for her. She saw Kyle casting a spell. She glared at him as she realized that he had said earlier that all she did was ask him for help without giving him anything in returns. She was shocked as she realized that she had been completely ignoring him. She wondered if she was really that terrible. She understood that if he suddenly became bored, he might tell her secret. She remembered for a moment that he had said he wanted a kiss instead of a thank you. The young lady looked at her friend and called him. He looked at her in surprise. A moment later, she pulled him closer to her and kissed him on the cheek. She looked at him and confusedly asked if they were even now. A moment later, she was transported by magic. Kyle laughed in embarrassment as he realized that she had acted truly insidiously. After a few minutes of moving, the young lady was at home. She was in shock and very embarrassed, and wondered if maybe she shouldn't have done this after all. She learned that, before the wedding, she was not allowed to kiss anyone at all. She was shocked because she understood that she could not even kiss anyone on the cheek, but still she acted so rashly. She was shocked and wondered how she should behave the next time they met. She decided to push all thoughts away, since it was a simple thank you, and the kiss had no meaning. She understood that she did not need to take this to heart. A moment later, her brother burst into her room. She flinched in surprise. Liam called out to her furiously and looked surprised that she had actually returned home. She looked at him in surprise and asked how he knew that she had returned. She said that he scared her very much. The young man looked at his sister and said to feel powerful magic nearby. But now this is not about that. He used his magic and her hair grew back. Liam told her to change clothes, soon as the situation was getting worse and worse. Her brother said he and his parents lied and told the crown prince she was still going. The young man looked at his sister and said that thank God the crown prince agreed and decided to wait for her. Liam gave his sister an errand to the maids. He said that they would do everything quickly. The maids said with a smile that he could rely on them and they would do everything. The maids greeted the young lady with a smile and said that they were delighted that the crown prince himself had decided to meet her. They told her that they would do everything in their power, and she would simply shine, the young lady promised, as she was very scared that they were getting excited. She looked at them timidly and asked them to be gentle with her. Liam walked out the door and sighed heavily. He was very glad that his sister returned, as he understood that the situation would soon improve. The young lady's parents were shocked, but at the same time very happy that she returned home. The young lady looked at her parents in surprise. Her mother ran up to her in surprise and asked what it all meant. She said that she could not believe that the crown prince himself had come to them to meet her. Her mother asked in surprise when they managed to become so close to the prince. The father ran up to their daughter and angrily asked if she had really done something to the academy. He did not understand how she could behave rudely towards the crown prince. She looked at her parents and said that everything was not as they thought. But still she understood that she could not say this for sure. Her mother pushed her father away with a smile and said that, nevertheless, the crown prince was a magnificent young man. She said he was handsome and gave the same impression that people talk about. She said that if he became her partner, she would be very happy for them. Her husband was shocked. The Marquis looked at her and asked what she was saying. He said that there was no way they could cancel their daughter's engagement. The Marquise came closer to her daughter and asked with a smile on her face who her heart was with. Madame asked who her daughter wanted as her partner, the crown prince or rich. The young lady looked at her parents and realized that her mother was still the same as before. She called them. The young lady said that their relationship with the crown prince is not what they think it is. But she still wondered why he came to meet her and not her brother. She thought for a moment, because she didn't know the answer to this question. She thought that most likely he could come as he wanted to meet and talk with her because of that bruise at the ball. Liam looked at his parents and said that they were already talking and it was time for them to go. Liam said that His Highness is still waiting for the young lady. He looked at his sister and said that they had taken him to the gazebo in the garden, so she needed to hurry. The young lady wondered what could be on the prince's mind if he was not going to leave until he met hers. She understood that since it had come to this, she had no other choice but to see him. The young lady decided to cheer up a little and throw all her thoughts away. She understood that he could execute her family at any moment. Just like last time, Lenali understood that in any case, she should take care of her feelings and emotions. She told herself that she was the daughter of a marquise and should behave accordingly. She understood that she needed to concentrate her mind properly. The crown prince was sitting in the garden. He was patiently waiting for the young lady. He remembered that unpleasant moment. The prince was confused because he could not think that the young man would suddenly cry. He was very sad about this, as he only wanted to protect his friend. The crown prince wondered what went wrong. The crown prince remembered the beautiful young lady of his friend's sister. He came here in a fit of emotion, without any warning. He thought that perhaps she already knew the real reason for his tears. The crown prince reassured himself and said that it was not because he just wanted to meet him. A moment later, he heard footsteps and turned around. Turning around, he saw a beautiful young lady in front of him. Milady looked closely at the crown prince and thanked him for waiting so long. Dylan looked at her confusedly, as he couldn't take his eyes off her beautiful beauty. She looked at him in surprise and asked how she could help him. The young lady saw that he was not answering at all and called him again. The prince looked at her shyly and said that she was beautiful. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. The prince said, embarrassed and fascinated, that she was so beautiful, like a goddess. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear something like that. Lanieli became very embarrassed and asked him not to flirt with her, as she might misunderstand him. Prince Dylan looked at her embarrassedly and said that he had never said such a thing to anyone. The young lady raised her gaze to him in surprise and embarrassment and looked intently. She was very surprised to hear such words. For some time they stood and looked at each other intently, without uttering a word. The young lady was shocked and did not understand what was going on in his head, since he said that she was beautiful like a goddess. She was sure that this was not the first time the prince had said something like this. She understood that he could not be trusted under any circumstances. He looked at her and said that the weather was good today. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that it was so. The prince looked at her and asked what she was thinking of doing today. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was going to take care of personal matters. A moment later, an incomprehensible atmosphere appeared between them. Looking away, the prince asked if she was angry that he had arrived without warning. The young lady said that was not the case. He looked at her in surprise and asked if he had done something else to make her so angry with him. She looked away and said that wasn't true. But he and she were engaged, so Lena Lee didn't see anything good in such meetings. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was just because of this. She looked away and didn't answer the question. She understood that if he really knew what made her angry, he wouldn't say something like that. She just didn't want to get involved with a man who did such a terrible thing to her family. The crown prince screamed loudly and angrily, said that he had no idea what the twins had in mind. The young lady was dumbfounded. She was shocked by his behavior, as she did not expect him to scream so suddenly. The crown prince shouted angrily and asked why they were both always angry with him. The young lady looked at the prince with fury. She asked if he himself didn't realize the reason for his anger. She looked at him and asked if he didn't understand what she was talking about. The crown prince looked at the young lady in surprise. She angrily asked if he thought she didn't know how he abused her brother in front of everyone. The crown prince was taken aback by the young lady's statement. A moment later, looking away from her, he said that it was all in the past. She looked at him angrily and asked if he was saying that this was already in the past. The prince said that perhaps when he first met her brother, he did not like him and saw him as an enemy. The prince said he doesn't deny it, but things have changed recently. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if this was all. She asked the prince if he understood how her brother had suffered all this time. She shouted with rage and asked if he realized this. She knew that her brother was constantly under this pressure, and so that they would not worry about him. He kept everything a secret. But unfortunately, when everything came to light, it was already too late. And this was all due to the fact that the prince allegedly did not like her brother. The crown prince looked away from the young lady and quietly said that he was very sorry. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Dylan sadly said that it was all due to his own weakness. He said that of course he understands that it is too late to apologize now, but he still wanted to do it. Initially, it was simple hostility. His hair and eye color reminded the prince of his mother. He thought that he had already forgotten about it. That terrible memory of his which he so badly wanted to forget. The young man looked dumbfounded at his mother and called her. He saw a destroyed room and his mother sitting on the ground. His memories suddenly came back to him when he met Liam. For this reason, he literally went crazy. Lanely looked at the prince in surprise. She could not utter a word. Sometime later, they walked silently in the garden. She looked at the prince in surprise because she did not think that he would ask for forgiveness from her, but she still wondered why he looked so exhausted. She wondered if it was because of his misdeed. Lost in her thoughts, she did not notice how she gave in and began to fall. The prince caught her and told her to be careful. He looked at her and asked if she was hurt. Lanali mumbled quietly that she was fine. She was shocked and noticed that they were standing too close. She pushed him away and thanked him for catching her. The crown prince hugged her tighter and didn't let go. She looked at him in surprise and asked for forgiveness. She said she was fine and asked him to let her go. The prince looked at her and asked her permission, since he wanted to stand with her in his arms a little longer. The young lady was very embarrassed. She said that this could not be done, because if someone noticed, they would think that they were in a relationship. The prince hugged her tenderly and said that they could think whatever they wanted, since he didn't care about rumors. Lanali looked at the prince in surprise, as she did not expect him to say something like that. She noticed that he touched her cheek. She looked at him in surprise. The crown prince looked at the young lady shyly and said that he liked her. The crown prince hugged the young lady tightly. Lanali asked the prince in surprise if he really liked her. The prince sighed heavily and said that it was so, and he liked her very much since that very first meeting. She was surprised since their first meeting was when she fell on him. The young lady pushed the crown prince away and said that she had had enough of such jokes. Lanali said that she was sure this was a one-time delusion. He looked at her in surprise and said that she was mistaken and he was really in love with her. The young lady pushed the crown prince away and shouted that she had a fiance. Turning away from him, she said that he also had a fiance. He looked at her and out of sadness said that from that very day, he thought only about her, and no matter what he did in his head, only thoughts about her. The young lady was dumbfounded and embarrassed. She did not expect to hear such words from him. She remembered the young lady who said that the prince told her that he loved only her. The young lady thought for a moment and realized that most likely the prince says such words only when he himself needs it. Looking at him, she understood that he could not be trusted under any circumstances. She looked away from him and said that apparently meeting a person like her was something new for him. The prince looked at her and said that was not the point. He said he liked her and was sincere with her. The prince said that he had never thought about someone so often, that just at the thought, his heart beat like crazy. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and wondered if he was telling her the truth now. But still, she wondered why on that day he was going to execute Lady Sicily, who was his beloved fiancé. She also wondered why it was necessary to execute her entire family. She turned away from him and said that sooner or later his feelings would cool down. She said that, in this case, he would want to execute her in the same way as he was going to execute his own bride. The crown prince was shocked by the young lady's words. He called her, but she was already leaving him. She was shocked because she didn't know what to do in this situation. She didn't want to tell him something like that, but still she knew that he was a cruel prince who could execute her at any moment, since he even wanted to execute his bride whom he once loved. She breathed heavily and thought about everything as she understood that he was just a cruel tyrant. But still, she understood that she was most likely the worst one here too. Despite her words somewhere deep down, she thought that the crown prince would not kill her. Without expecting it or realizing it, she began to trust him even though he was so hateful to her. The young lady calmed herself and said that she needed to come to her senses as soon as possible, and that that man was responsible for the execution of her entire family. She understood that he could not trust him. The crown prince ran up behind her and grabbed her hand. Dylan wanted to talk to her and asked her to wait. He looked at her and asked me to run away. The young lady looked at him in surprise. A moment later, she shouted and asked for him. He grayly shouted that they would let her go and asked her to listen to him. He said that he would not execute her under any circumstances. The young lady was taken aback after hearing what he said. A moment later, she calmly turned towards him. But a moment later, she shouted and asked how he could say such a thing. She said that someday his feelings would cool down and he would harm her. He looked at her and asked what if this were to be the case. She froze in place. The crown prince stared at the young lady and asked her not to push away his feelings now. They stood in silence for some time, looking at each other. She wondered what would happen next. She understood that what would happen next would only be the execution of her entire family, since this was an obvious fact. She knew that no matter how sincere he was, she couldn't trust him. The young lady glared at the crown prince. She was taken aback and wondered why he was looking at her so intently. She was shocked because she understood that now the prince who was in front of her was completely different from the one from his past life. The prince looked at the young lady and said that they were not asking her to reciprocate his feelings now. He looked at her sadly and said that he just wanted to express his feelings to her. He knew that no one had ever loved him. Therefore, he thought that he simply did not know such a feeling as love. But now he wanted to sincerely hold on to this feeling for as long as possible. The young lady looked at the crown prince intently and in surprise. They looked at each other in silence for some time, and no one said a word. Liam stood behind a tree and listened. He was in shock at what just happened. He was shocked and wondered, since when did his sister have such a relationship with the crown prince? Looking at them, he realized that something was wrong between them. For a moment he thought and sighed heavily. A moment later, he called his sister and asked where she was. The crown prince looked to the side in surprise. The young lady asked the prince for forgiveness and said that she had to leave for today. She bowed to him and said that she would go. The prince looked intently after the leaving young lady, but a moment later, he noticed that her brother, the crown prince, had approached her and looked at the young man in surprise. He wondered if he had always been tall. The prince looked at the young man with surprise, since before he seemed smaller and more fragile. He remembered that his voice was also lower. Liam looked at his sister confused and said that he was very surprised. He looked at his sister and asked if the crown prince really liked her. The young man asked when they managed to become so close. The young man said with a smile that he thought that the crown prince was a terrible person, but who would have thought that he had so many feelings for Linley? Liam said with a smile that for a second it seemed to him that they were in some kind of romance. While he was saying this, he noticed the sad expression on his sister's face. He looked at her and said with a smile that I don't know if he should tell her, but still he wanted to tell her, as he was her brother. He smiled and said they looked great together. She angrily shouted that he should not say such things for fun. The young man looked at his sister in surprise, since he did not expect her to behave in such a way. The young lady asked her brother in surprise whether he and His Majesty were suitable for each other. She told him to stop joking like that. Liam looked at his sister and asked why she was so vehemently rejecting the crown prince. He said that he had wondered this question for a long time. The young lady sighed heavily, but did not answer. Liam looked at her and said that she even decided to pretend to be a man in order to go to the academy. He looked at her and asked what she was hiding from him. The young lady was dumbfounded, as she did not know what to tell him. He looked at her and with a soft smile said that she could share anything with him since he was her brother. The young lady looked closely at her brother. She knew that he was constantly suffering, holding all the pain inside himself. She wondered if she could allow him to share these terrible memories with her. She wondered if she should tell her that you had a past life that executed them all. She didn't know if he would believe her words. Liam said with a smile that he would be on her side no matter what. The young lady burst into tears and called her brother. A moment later, she thanked him. Lena looked at him and asked if he would listen to her. Lena told her brother about everything. She said that she was reborn and that all the members of their family were killed by the prince. She said that she was now trying her best to change their future. Her brother listened to her very carefully and took her story seriously. The young man looked at his sister and asked in bewilderment if she was sure that this was the work of the prince himself. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. He said that the prince seemed to him very timid and unable to restrain his feelings for any person. Liam said that he doesn't think his character has changed much since her rebirth. He said that he can't even wrap his head around it. He said that it's not like the prince is a two-faced person who was able to plan all this on his own. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise and asked if he really wanted to say that he was led by someone from outside. She asked if it was a name, but this is a man, and is responsible for the death of their family. She looked at him and asked if he really meant that. The young man nodded in response. The young lady froze in bewilderment. He looked at her and said that his false accusation and her broken engagement, and the fact that at the time of their execution, he was on an expedition. He said that, in his opinion, the circumstances had turned out too, fortunately. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise. Liam said that if Rich had not left, he would definitely have tried to prevent the execution. The young lady thought for a moment, as there was true truth in her brother's words, since she had not been able to think it through properly that time. He looked at her and asked how she thought about the outcome of his thoughts. Liam said that the Lors family and the Wergman family were families of descendants of knights, each with their own distinguished history, and her betrothal to Rich would only strengthen their alliance. He said that he believed that you, in turn, would greatly upset the balance of power of the aristocrats. However, His Highness, as a member of the imperial family, would have nothing to do with such a marriage. He looked at his sister and asked if there was anyone else, besides the prince, who would benefit from getting rid of their family. She looked at her brother and wondered if this was possible. She was shocked because she had never even thought about such a thing. She was shocked because she understood that she had always believed that everything was your fault, Crown Prince, and that was why she hated him so much. Liam sighed heavily and said that whatever it was just his guess. The young lady was currently feeling very terrible for hating the Crown Prince. The young man looked at his sister and asked with a smile if they would really act together now. He said that he was very sorry that she had to deal with everything alone before us. He thanked her for trying so hard with a smile on his face. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise and burst into tears. She understood that now she had a brother, but on her side, and she was very happy about it. A few days later, the ball was supposed to take place. Rich looked sideways at the young lady. He cursed inside himself as he was amazed by the beauty of his bride. His inner voice shouted loudly that she was beautiful. He understood that in every dress she looked simply incomparable. He noticed that her languid appearance was no less beautiful. He twitched with anger because he understood that other men were not worthy to see such beauty of his bride. He refused if it had not been an invitation to the ball from Krisha's family. He wondered if it was now too late to return back. The young lady looked at her companion in surprise. She noticed that he seemed to be in a bad mood. She noticed that he was frowning more than usual. She wondered if she had done something wrong. The young people gazed in surprise at the newly arriving guests. The young people whispered how they were very surprised that today young Mr. Wergman was with the couple. They never would have thought that they would suddenly see him at the ball. The young lady saw the crown prince and his friends in the distance. She noticed the prince and didn't even know how to look into his eyes now. The young lady sighed heavily and looked away from them. A moment later, Lena Lee noticed Kyle staring at her intently. They locked eyes, and he smiled at her with his radiant smile. She remembered that she promised him that she would definitely dance with him at the next ball. The young lady was taken aback as she realized what she would have to do. She was shocked because she realized that she had promised him to dance with him today. But she understood that now it was completely impossible. She was shocked. I didn't know what to do now. She understood that her companion was already in a bad mood. And the situation with the crown prince was not easy. She had a very bad feeling about today's score. The young lady looked closely at the room. She of course understood that they were in the Duke's house, but still he was incredibly luxurious. She thought for a moment, since it was her first time at the ball with her fiancé. Despite this, he was still very menacing and gloomy. Lenali noticed that he was clearly not in a good mood today. He usually avoided such events, which suggests that he didn't like them, but today he only agreed because she went. A moment later, she saw Kayla came closer to her and greeted her with a smile. He took her hand and kissed it tenderly. Lenali froze in place. She did not expect this. She looked at him surprised and embarrassed and greeted him. She also thanked him for inviting him to the ball. But a moment later, her fiancé stood between them. Lenali looked at him in surprise and called. He looked at the young man and thanked him angrily for the invitation to the ball. Kyle smiled and said that he had not already been given, that he also decided to come, although he would have been satisfied only with her presence. The young lady looked at Kyle in surprise. Rich looked at the young man and said that she was his fiancée, and there was no work in the nightly order yet, so he had free time. Kyle looked at him and said that the fact remains that he doesn't really go to ballrooms. Kyle smiled and said that he thought that Rich was using the excuse of working to keep the sweet and beautiful Lena Lee locked up. Rich was furious because Kyle was saying about his fiance that she was very sweet. Rich took his bride by the arm and said that they were leaving. The young lady looked at Kyle in surprise. A moment later, she and her companion went outside. The young man was very angry because, as he expected, she was quite popular among men. He understood that this could be understood from the looks of those guys. He was shocked and wondered if she really received such attention at every event. Rich was confronted by Kyle, who was furiously flirting with his fiancée. Rich thought that Kyle didn't like the girl, but now it was very clear that he had his eye on his fiancée. The young lady looked at her companion. Lenali looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted to leave the way they had just arrived recently. The young man looked away from her, but did not answer. A moment later, he said they would be here for the rest of the evening. He understood that it was safe here, and no one would look at his beautiful lady. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he wanted to be here for the rest of the evening. He timidly said that he didn't want anyone to look at her. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect him to say something like that. She thought that she looked so bad today that he was even embarrassed to stand next to her. The young lady looked at her companion with rage. Lenali shouted with rage that since he was uncomfortable with her, she would now go dance with Mr. Kyle. The young man was dumbfounded by the words of his companion. He did not expect her to say something like that. He looked at her and asked why she suddenly mentioned his name again. The young lady said in her fury that he didn't like her company, and that's why she said so. She was about to leave when he took her hand and shouted that it was not so. She looked at him in surprise because she did not expect him to stop her. A moment later, he said that if his partner was not her, then there was no point in it. The young lady was dumbfounded and stared at her companion. She was in shock, as she did not expect him to say such a thing. Lenali heard him say that if she was not the couple, then there was no point in dancing. Lenali froze and looked at him intently. The young man looked at his companion and said that he had simply expressed himself incorrectly. He looked at her and said that he did not want others to enjoy her beauty. The young lady looked at her companion in confusion. Looking at him, she wondered if he was really the one she had known for so long. She understood that it seemed that he was not joking and was telling her the truth. She sighed heavily and said embarrassedly that she seemed to have misunderstood everything. She timidly looked away and asked his forgiveness for being angry. Her words struck him to the heart and stuck in his chest. She looked at him and said with a smile that they had come all this way to attend the ball. She pulled his hand. He was shocked by her. The young lady looked at her companion and said with a smile that they could at least dance. He was very embarrassed by her radiant smile. A moment later, they entered the hall. Everyone was whispering as they saw the beautiful couple in front of them. They were fascinated by them and said that their beautiful couple simply could not help but bring a smile to their face. Lenali was having fun with her fiancé, smiling and dancing. The young lady looked at her companion and said with a smile that she thought he was only good at wielding a sword, but he turns out to be a very good dancer. Rich looked at his companion with a smile and said that she was also an excellent dancer. He looked at her and said that she had calluses from the sword, so she needed to take care of her precious hands. She looked at him in surprise and said with a smile that he spoke just like her father. She sighed heavily and said that she had been training to her will for a long time, so she couldn't do anything about it. The young man looked intently at his companion. He noticed that she was simply incredible at dancing and perfection itself. But still, the young man was very irritated as the men around him admired his beautiful companion. But still, he understood that retreat was no longer an option, and he would have to dance with her, but he was very happy about it. The young people had fun and enjoyed each other's company, dancing a beautiful dance. The crown prince looked sideways at the young lady. He was very upset because he wanted her to dance only with him. He saw her beautiful and radiant smile. He did not want to share it with anyone. But still, he sighed heavily and thought that this was just his fantasy. The young ladies noticed that the crown prince was not taking his eyes off the young beautiful lady. The other lady supported her companion and said that she also thought about it, and they also remembered the incident that happened during the holidays. One lady said that it seemed that the crown prince had come to have a private meeting with the young lady at the estate. Kyle, who was standing next to the young ladies, heard their conversation and was shocked. The young lady looked with surprise at the couple dancing and asked if this was all true. She said that Mrs. Lennelly already had Mr. Bergman. They looked at them intently and said that now they fit each other very harmoniously, and from the outside, they seemed like a perfect couple. Kyle in turn stared at the young lady. He was angry and did not feel the best. He was stunned by the news that the crown prince was visiting her during the holidays, as he felt betrayed and used. A moment later, he remembered how she came running to him, and with tears in her eyes said that she had a request for him on which her life depended. Kyle was shocked by what he just realized. After the dance, the lady bowed to her companion with a smile on her face, since it was her first dance at the ball. She was very happy because thanks to her companion, the dance was a success. But a moment later, she heard someone calling her. Turning around, she saw that Kyle was approaching her. She looked at him in surprise as she noticed that he had a very menacing and angry expression on his face. He looked at her and with a grin asked if she could still give him a dance. Lennelly understood that she had recently made promises to Kyle that she would dance with him, but still she was very worried and hesitant since her fiance was next to her. She understood that right now she could not do this under any circumstances. Rich looked at Kyle menacingly and angrily and called him. Kyle in turn sighed heavily and walked closer to the young lady. He said with a smile that it was very noisy here. Looking at her, he asked, "Why don't they retire somewhere else?" Rich looked at Kyle angrily and aggressively. He was shocked by such impudence of the young man. A moment later, Kyle cast a spell and they began to move. Rich in turn shouted to his companion and called her. A moment later, they disappeared from the banquet hall. Rich was beside himself with anger, wondering what Kyle was up to. The young lady looked at her companion in surprise and asked why he suddenly moved them. So suddenly, Kyle said with a grin that it was all because it was time for someone to pay their bills. The young lady was shocked. She said that she did not deny that she had made promises to him, but there was no question of him dragging her away by force. Kyle looked at her and said with a smirk that it looked like she didn't want to dance with him in the first place. The young lady timidly hesitated and did not answer. Lennelly understood that Kyle had invited her right in front of her fiancé. Lennelly wondered if he didn't understand what it looked like from the outside. A moment later, she turned around and saw a beautiful meadow of flowers that were beautiful. The young lady was fascinated by the wonderful beauty that she saw around her. She was dumbfounded and said that it was just a beautiful garden. Kyle sighed heavily and sadly said that this was his only favorite place in this house. He looked at the beautiful lady and said that he would like to dance with her here. He smiled and said that no one would bother them here, since there was no one here except them. She looked surprised and embarrassed at her companion. She wondered how you were in such a beautiful place alone with him. She felt just like with a prince from a fairy tale. The young lady looked at him intently. She was a little puzzled, as he still did not look at her. She was surprised and did not understand why the atmosphere around him now was different from usual. A moment later, he pulled her sharply. The young lady was very scared. Lennelly looked at him and angrily called out to him and told him to be careful. But the young man only looked into the distance and did not answer. Her Lennelly looked at him and called. A moment later, she said she thought he was angry about something. Kyle looked sideways at her in surprise and asked why she thought that. She looked at him and said that after today, he was somehow unusual and was not behaving like before. He looked away and said it wasn't that he was angry. Kyle looked at her and asked with a sly grin if she was hiding something from him. She was surprised, looked at him and asked what he was talking about. Lennelly wondered if she had really deceived him about something. He looked at her and asked if she would pretend as if nothing had happened. Kyle said that he heard that the crown prince came to visit her at the estate. She looked at him dumbfounded and asked how he knew about this. He looked at her and asked if she really liked using him in this way. The young lady was taken aback. She said that everything was wrong and she had no bad intentions. He looked at her and asked if she remembered what he told her earlier. He looked at her and said that if he got tired of it, he would tell her everything. The young man looked at her with a grin and said that now the situation was clearly not in his favor. Lennelly froze in place with shock. She did not understand why he spoke and behaved like that, but she saw that he was speaking in all seriousness.